The Preface of the Countess of Lowndes Square and Other Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Zechariah Raman. The Countess of Lowndes Square and Other Stories by E.F. Benson. Preface. I have divided the stories that are here collected under one cover into various classes, so that such readers as want to compare their own experiments, let us say, in blackmailing or spiritualistic seances, with those of other students, may find such tales as deal with their own speciality in crime or superstition grouped together in separate sections of this book. They will thus be spared a skipping hunt through pages in which they feel no personal interest. In the same way, such readers as are in search of merely the lighter, though not more decorative, aspects of life will be able to avoid like poison so innocent-looking a title as The Countess of Lowndes Square, for assuredly they would not find therein the fashionable descriptions of high life which they might reasonably anticipate, but would merely cast the book from them in disgust when they discovered that one who had been the wife of an earl, and ought therefore to have known ever so much better, belonged to the most contemptible of the criminal classes. The table of contents in like manner conducts the crank and the cat lover to the pastures where he is most likely to find a digestible snack. The short story is not a lyre on which the English writers thrum with the firm delicacy of the French or with the industry of the American author. If the 10 best short stories in the world were proclaimed by popular vote, it is probable that they would all be French stories, while if the million worst stories in the world were similarly brought into one unspeakable library, they would probably all of them, with the exception of course of the 14 that make up this volume, be found to be written in America. There is something in the precision and economy of the French, something in the opulence and amateurishness of the United States that renders the result of such a plebiscite perfectly appropriate, and we should only, when the result of the poll was known, find in it another instance of the invariable occurrence of the expected. Most of the ensuing tales have appeared before in the pages of Nash's Weekly, the Windsor Magazine, the Storyteller, the Century, and the Woman at Home. The rest are now published for the first time. E.F. Benson. End of Preface. The Preface of the Countess of Lowndes Square and Other Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Zechariah Raman. The Countess of Lowndes Square and Other Stories by E.F. Benson. Preface. I have divided the stories that are here collected under one cover into various classes, so that such readers as want to compare their own experiments, let us say, in blackmailing or spiritualistic seances, with those of other students, may find such tales as deal with their own speciality in crime or superstition grouped together in separate sections of this book. They will thus be spared a skipping hunt through pages in which they feel no personal interest. In the same way, such readers as are in search of merely the lighter, though not more decorative, aspects of life will be able to avoid like poison so innocent-looking a title as The Countess of Lowndes Square, for assuredly they would not find therein the fashionable descriptions of high life which they might reasonably anticipate, but would merely cast the book from them in disgust when they discovered that one who had been the wife of an earl, and ought therefore to have known ever so much better, belonged to the most contemptible of the criminal classes. The table of contents in like manner conducts the crank and the cat lover to the pastures where he is most likely to find a digestible snack. The short story is not a lyre on which the English writers thrum with the firm delicacy of the French or with the industry of the American author. If the 10 best short stories in the world were proclaimed by popular vote, it is probable that they would all be French stories, while if the million worst stories in the world were similarly brought into one unspeakable library, they would probably all of them, with the exception of course of the 14 that make up this volume, be found to be written in America. There is something in the precision and economy of the French, something in the opulence and amateurishness of the United States that renders the result of such a plebiscite perfectly appropriate, and we should only, when the result of the poll was known, find in it another instance of the invariable occurrence of the expected. Most of the ensuing tales have appeared before in the pages of Nash's Weekly, the Windsor Magazine, the Storyteller, the Century, and the Woman at Home. The rest are now published for the first time. E. F. Benson. End of Preface. The Preface of the Countess of Lowndes Square and Other Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Zechariah Rahman. The Countess of Lowndes Square and Other Stories by E. F. Benson. Preface. I have divided the stories that are here collected under one cover into various classes, so that such readers as want to compare their own experiments, let us say, in blackmailing or spiritualistic seances, with those of other students, may find such tales as deal with their own speciality in crime or superstition grouped together in separate sections of this book. They will thus be spared a skipping hunt through pages in which they feel no personal interest. In the same way, such readers as are in search of merely the lighter, though not more decorative, aspects of life will be able to avoid like poison so innocent-looking a title as The Countess of Lowndes Square, for assuredly they would not find therein the fashionable descriptions of high life which they might reasonably anticipate, but would merely cast the book from them in disgust when they discovered that one who had been the wife of an earl, and ought there.
Section 1 of The Countess of Lowndes Square and Other Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jim's Vox 4. The Countess of Lowndes Square and Other Stories by E. F. Benson. Section 1. Blackmailing Stories. Chapter 1. The Countess of Lowndes Square. Cynthia, Countess of Hampshire, was sitting in an extraordinarily elaborate dressing gown one innocent morning in June, alternately opening letters and eating spoonfuls of sour milk, prepared according to the prescription of Professor Metchnikoff. Every day it made her feel younger and stronger and more irresponsible, which is the root of all joy to natures of a serious disposition. And since, when a fortnight before she began this abominable treatment, She felt very young already. She was now almost afraid that she would start again on measles, croup, hoops, whooping cough, peppermints, and other childish ailments and passions. But since this treatment not only induced youth, but was discouraging to all microbes but its own, she hoped as regards ailments that she would continue to feel younger and younger without suffering the penalties of childhood. The sour milk was finished long before her letters were all opened, and there was no one in London who had a larger and more festive post than she. Indeed, it was no wonder that everybody of sense, and most people of none, wanted her to eat their dinners and stay in their houses, for her volcanic enjoyment of life made the dullest of social functions a high orgy, and since nothing is nearly so infectious as enjoyment, it followed that she was in much request. Even in her 50th year she retained, with her youthful zest for life, much of the extreme plainness of her girlhood. But time was gradually lightening the heaviness of feature that had once formed so remarkable an ugliness, and in a few years more, no doubt, she would become as nice-looking as everybody else of her age. Her father, the notorious, probably infamous, Baron Cacao, of mixed and uncertain origin, had at one time compiled, by hook or crook, chiefly, it is to be feared, by crook, an immense fortune, but long after that was spent, and debts of an equally substantial nature had been substituted for it, he continued to live in London in a blaze of splendour so oriental that he was still believed to be possessed of fabulous wealth, and had, without the least difficulty, married the plain but fascinating Cynthia to an elderly Earl of Hampshire, and had continued to allow her £10,000 a year, which he borrowed at a staggering rate of usury from optimistic Hebrews. They thought that Lord Hampshire would probably see to his father-in-law's debts, while, rather humorously, Lord Hampshire was post-obiting himself with others who trusted that Baron Cacao would come to the rescue of his son-in-law. Consequently, when he and Cynthia's disgusting husband expired within a few hours of each other, the widowed and orphaned Countess was left without a penny in the world, and in Rama there was a voice heard, lamentation and great mourning. Father and husband were both sad rogues, and in death, in more than a chronological sense, it is highly probable that they were not divided. It will, therefore, be easily imagined that her childhood and marriage had been a sound and liberal education to Lady Hampshire, for they had taught her that the world in general is very easily imposed upon, and that if you are intending to be a villain, the path of villainy is made much smoother to the pilgrim if he smiles. Shakespeare, perhaps, had given her the germ of that invaluable truth, but, as in countless other instances, her brilliant brain brought to full flower what was only an immature bud of knowledge. In any case, the villain, so she shrewdly reasoned, must... Section 2 of The Countess of Lowndes Square and Other Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jim's Vox 4. The Countess of Lowndes Square and Other Stories by E. F. Benson. Section 2. Blackmailing Stories. Chapter 2. The Blackmailer of Park Lane. Arthur Whately had known very well what it was like to be desperately poor, and in consequence, when he became so desperately rich that money ceased to mean anything to him, his pity for the penurious was not hysterical or exaggerated. He could recall very vividly what it felt like to have neither tea, dinner, nor supper, and to wake in the morning, stiff and cold as armour, on a bench on the embankment, and see the ridiculous needle of Cleopatra stonily pointing heavenwards against the sky, in which the stars were beginning to burn dim at the chilly approach of day. He had known how icy the feet become when they have been close clasped all night long in the frayed embraces of gaping leather. But he had known also how sweet and surprising it is to eat when food is imperiously demanded by the cravings of long-continued abstinence, and how ineffably luxurious to get warm when limbs have ached themselves numb. He would have been willing to confess that unveneered destitution had its inconveniences, but it was false sentiment to deny that it had its compensations also. It was when he was just 16 that Luck, the great veiled goddess whom all the world so wisely worships, had paid him her first visit. He had been hanging about at the covered portico of the Lyceum Theatre one night, watching the well-fed world being lumpily deposited at the doors, when a silly old pink gentleman, in paying his cabman, dropped a promising pocketbook in the roadway. For 1/2 second the boy deliberated, wondering instinctively, though he had never heard of the proverb, if honesty was the best policy. In other words, how much the pocketbook contained, and how much the foolish old gentleman would give him if he picked it up and returned it. A couple of pence, perhaps, for he looked a coppery gent. But the debate lasted scarcely longer than it took the pocketbook to fall. In a moment his wise decision was made. He had picked it up, recognizing in that delightful incident the smile of the great goddess, had dived under the Roman nose of the cab-horse, and fled into the street where a chill, unpleasant rain was falling. Luck still smiled on him, for the night was foggy, and as soon as he had crossed the street he dropped into the habitual shuffling pace of the homeless, and returned to the portico which he had so lately quitted, since it was theoretically impossible that the thief should do anything so foolish. The silly old pink gentleman had not yet ceased to gesticulate and gibber in the direction in which he himself had just vanished, and an obsequious policeman was apparently taking down all the bad words he used in a neat notebook. Arthur wondered if he would arrest the old man for indulging in language redolent of faint praise in a public place. Meantime he had thrust the pocketbook, that incarnate smile of the beneficent goddess, into his shirt, and it slid comfortably down against his skin till it was brought to anchor by the string which he had so strictly tied round his braceless trousers, since pressure in those regions minimized the abhorrence of vacuum. Then he slouched back to the embankment, and with head bowed over his knees, as if in sleep, he counted the tale of his treasure, taking out each item separately and screening them from the parental scrutiny of policemen in the cavern of his hand. There were 2 pieces of the fabulous crinkly paper. There were 3 sovereigns, and, what was immensely important for immediate purposes, a couple of shillings, translatable without suspicion into rich fried fish. One of his trouser pockets was a secure harbourage, and into this he piloted the golden ship. Then, with a stroke of high wisdom, he thrust the pocketbook through the interstices of the bench, instead of keeping about him so incriminating a piece of merchandise, and slouched away, saying good-bye to roofless bedchambers by the sweet Thameside forever. Tonight, as he sat in the great dining-room of his house in Park Lane, the memory of that divine evening was vividly brought to his mind. 3 friends had dined with him, and as the night proved foggy, they had abandoned the idea of seeing the most incompletely clad dancer that the London County Council had at present licensed, and had decided to stay at home and play bridge. "A cold, foggy night, sir," had been the pronouncement that followed the butler's news that the... Section 3 of The Countess of Lowndes Square and Other Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jim's Vox 4. The Countess of Lowndes Square and Other Stories by E. F. Benson. Blackmailing Stories, Chapter 2, The Blackmailer of Park Lane, continued. It was about 12 o'clock on the Friday morning that a dejected four-wheeler stopped opposite Martin's Library, and the ambulatory population of Wardour Street, accustomed to all manner of eccentricities, looked with wonder at the garish figure that emerged. 2 hours before, Arthur Whately had set off from Park Lane with a small portmanteau and had driven to the Charing Cross Hotel, having adjusted moustache and imperial with the aid of a small looking-glass in the cab, and had taken a room for a widower of the name of George Loring, paying for one night's habitation. There he had effected his change of clothes and left the valise containing the outer garments of Arthur Whately, at present in a state of suspended existence. He entered the library with a strutting martial air, and, as once before, the comfortable old lady looked up from her knitting and asked how she could serve him. "I have called for letters and parcels for Mr. George Loring," said Whately in a falsetto voice, which was the result of diligent practice. But a glance at pigeonhole L showed him that it was empty. "Yes, parcel and letter for Mr. George Loring," said the old dame. "But the parcel was too big to put in the pigeonhole, let alone lifting it, so I put them together somewhere. Dearie me, now, where was it?" "This is a strange way to conduct a public library," said Whately, forgetting all about the assumed falsetto, "that the librarian should not know where she has deposited the property of her subscribers. Mr. Martin would be far from pleased. I am pressed for time, madam. Business in the city." The old lady turned slowly round and beamed on him. "And as if I wasn't sitting on it all the time," she said. "Just for safety, as you may say. There, young man, you'll find it heavy, and the 6pence to pay." "A most reasonable charge, madam," said Whately. And can you tell me who left the parcel? What he looked like?" She nodded at him. "Such a fur coat I never see," she said. "And his motor fair stopped the traffic. I didn't take much account of his face, though I would swear to a beard." "A shrewd observer," said Whately in his most genial tones, and, staggering out of the shop with his parcel, deposited it on his own toe as he stepped into the cab. The pain was severe, and for the moment damped his ecstasy and caused him a loss of self-control. "Charing Cross Hotel, you old idiot!" was his unjustifiable direction to his cabman. As he drove there, he tore open the note. It ran as follows: "Dear sir, you have me completely in your power, and I send the money you demand. Kindly forward at once the documentary evidence you speak of. Faithfully yours, Peebles." Again he felt vaguely disappointed. The fish had given him less play than he hoped. He had but towed its sulking carcass to land. But then he did not know that there followed him, threading the intricacies of traffic close behind him, a taxicab in which was sitting a quiet-looking gentleman with pince-nez. Its destination also appeared to be Charing Cross Hotel. The hall porter opened the door of his cab, and Whately indicated his parcel. "Move that into the bureau, if you'll be so kind," he said. "It contains a model, a metal model, and is heavy. I'm going upstairs to change my clothes, and will be down again in 10 minutes." Less time than that was sufficient for him to resume the habiliments of Arthur Whately and stow the apparel of the vanished George Loring in his bag. His imperial and moustache he still wore, for it was his intention to use depilatory measures in the cab which took him back to Park Lane, lest the complete transformation might prove too staggering for the hall porter. This time he himself took the parcel, a wooden box, clearly wrapped up in brown paper, to his cab, put it not on his own foot, but on the seat opposite, and genially told the driver to take him to Park Lane. Close behind him followed the taxicab containing the gentleman with the pince-nez, modest, secluded, and unobserved. And from a few doors off he saw Mr. Arthur Whately, burdened with the parcel he had brought from Wardour Street, stagger into his own house. His business seemed to be not yet finished, for, having seen him home, he drove back to an office in the city, and was at once taken in to see the head of the firm. His interview lasted about half an hour, and he left behind him, when he went, a very much astonished gentleman, over whose mobile face a succession of queer secret smiles chased one another like gleams of sunshine on a cloudy day. Excellent businessman though he was, he gave for the rest of the day but a tepid attention to his work. Arthur Whately, meantime, was closeted with his gold. With the aid of a pair of nail scissors, for prudence counselled secrecy, he succeeded in raising the lid of the box and found it packed inside with smooth, discreet little sausages of white paper. A couple of these he unfolded, and from each flowed out a stream of clinking sovereigns. In each were a round 100, and the little sausages were 20 in number. He put a liberal handful of gold in his pocket. He locked the rest into the safe that stood in the bedroom. And those £2,000 were somehow sweeter to him than his whole unnumbered fortune. They seemed to him the reward of a cleverness that was more peculiarly his own than that which had amassed so huge a harvest in South African mines and American options. They were doubly sweet, for they were both the fruit of secret criminal processes and had been wrung by terror out of his friend. He lunched out that day. His soul basked in the heaven of high animal spirits which had so long been lost to him, and in the stimulus which the last week had brought to him he felt like a Peri who had regained paradise. Perhaps reaction would come, but for the present it held aloof, and in case it did, he could always, as he phrased it to himself as he walked lightly down Bond Street, apply the squeezers again to poor Peebles. The vocabulary, as well as the spirits of a schoolboy, had come back to him. Long-forgotten slang tripped off his tongue, and he examined shop windows with eager enthusiasm. There was a beautiful Charles II rat-tail spoon in a shop of old silver, and he entered and bought it, paying for it on the spot with 15 of his newly acquired sovereigns. The purchase gave him more pleasure than any he had made for years. It was the fruit of his splendid stroke of blackmail. At another shop he bought for £5 a charming figure of a seagull in Copenhagen china. Lord Peebles had a collection of this pale fabric, and his friend felt it would be a privilege to add to it. That also was paid for in gold, and after he had left each shop, a quiet man entered and conferred privately with the proprietor, leaving a companion outside who strolled after the millionaire. Returning home, he sent out a number of invitations for a dinner party in 10 days' time. A royal princess had intimated that she would like to dine with him that night, and he included in his invitations Lord and Lady Peebles, both of whom were snobs of purest ray serene. Later on, he would ask them again to some similar function, for he felt that 2 such invitations would make full compensation for the anxiety he had caused. He did not regard the bagatelle of gold. That meant nothing to either of them. Then, after an hour with his beautiful collection of Greek coins, he dressed and went out to dinner. Lord Peebles was of the party, and the two cut into a table of bridge afterwards and played for a couple of hours, with luck distinctly against the newly created peer. Generally, his losses caused him exquisite agony. Being very rich, he could not bear to be ever so little poorer. But tonight he laid down a couple of £10 notes with a smile. "I pay you, my dear Whately," he said, 40.
Section 4 of the Countess of Lowndes Square and Other Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kate Follis. The Countess of Lowndes Square and Other Stories by E.F. Benson. General Stories, Chapter 1. The Dance on the Beefsteak. This midsummer day, the early hours of which were bathed in so serene a sunshine, has ended in storm and hurly-burly. Only this morning the general outlook was as unclouded as is now the velvet blue of the star-scattered Italian sky. But this evening our very souls are driven like dead leaves before a shrivelling blast. Nature, unsympathetic, indifferent, still holds on her great unruffled courses. The stars wheel, the north wind blows lightly from across the gulf. The little ripples shed themselves in lines of phosphorescent flame. Naples lies a necklace of light on the edge of the sea. The loveliness of the southern night is undiminished. But Mrs. Mackellar has danced on the beefsteak, and she has dismissed Seraphina. To the dweller in cities or other light-minded and populous places, this may appear but the most farcical of tragedies, worthy of no more than the scoffing laugh of a passer-by. But such do not know Mrs. Mackellar, nor Seraphina, nor life in Alatri. For in Alatri, as a rule, nothing happens, certainly nothing unpleasant. Our lives are as smooth as the halcyon summer seas, and it will, I am afraid, be impossible to give to any but the most imaginative reader an adequate idea of the devastating nature of the catastrophe. It will be necessary in any case to recount in brief the events of the last 24 hours. Yesterday afternoon we were all en fête. Mrs. Mackellar gave a party for 2 reasons, either of which was amply justifiable. The first was that the engagement of Seraphina, her cook, to Antonio, her manservant, was definitely sanctioned by her, and so made food for public rejoicing. The second, that Seraphina had been with her as cook for an entire year. Now, in Alatri, servants do not, as a rule, stop with Mrs. Mackellar more than a few weeks. Then they leave. There is no dissatisfaction expressed and no public quarrel. They just lose their nerve and go away. But the days had added themselves into weeks, and the weeks into months, and before any of us knew where we were, Seraphina had been a year with Mrs. Mackellar. Hence the party. There were, in fact, 2 parties, for Seraphina and Antonio entertained their friends in the kitchen, while Mrs. Mackellar received on the house roof. She is an immense Scot.
Section 5 of the Countess of Lowndes Square and Other Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Michelle McFarland, Ballarat, Australia. The Countess of Lowndes Square and Other Stories by E.F. Benson. General Stories. Chapter 2. The Orielists. In spite of the unaccountable absence of a cabinet minister who should have sat between our hostess, Mrs. Withers, and Miss Agnes Lockett, I felt that this luncheon party must be considered as perhaps the most epoch-making that had, up to the present date, been enticed beneath that insatiably hospitable roof. Never had the comet-like orbit of our entertainer ascended quite so high towards the zenith. With the negligible exception of myself, for whose presence there I shall soon amply account, there was not one among us, man, woman, or child, for that prodigy on the fiddle, Dicky Sebastian, in his tight colossal sailor suit, was of the company, whose name was not thrillingly familiar to the great percentage of the readers of those columns in the daily press, which inform us who was in the park on Sunday, chatting with friends, or at the first night of the new play, looking lovely. Briefly, to tell the number and brightness of these stars, there was a much beribboned general from Salonika, a girl just engaged to the heir of one of our most respectable dukedoms, a repatriated prisoner from Ruhleben, a medium possessed of devastating insight, a prominent actress from a revue, a lion hunter, not our amiable hostess, but a swarthy taciturnity from East Africa, and the adorable Agnes Lockett, lately created a dame in the Order of the British Empire in connection with Secret Service. She had just been demobilised, and, as she freely admitted, 4 years of conundrums and traps had undermined the frankness of her disposition. Schemes, plans, intrigues had become, for the moment, a second nature to her, and she was not happy unless she was laying a trap for somebody else, or suspecting, quite erroneously, that somebody was laying a trap for her. She had also become a smooth conversational liar. These things had not, it may be mentioned, affected her charm and her beauty. Finally, there was myself, who had no claim to distinction of any kind beyond such as is inherent in living next door to Mrs. Withers and being honoured with the friendship of Agnes Lockett. I had been asked by telephone just at luncheon time, as I was in the act of sitting down to a tough and mournful omelette alone, and I naturally felt quite certain that I had been bidden to take the place of some guest, not the Cabinet Minister whom she still expected, who had disappointed Mrs. Withers at the last moment. This was confirmed by the fact that she told me in her clearest telephone voice that I had promised to come today, which I knew was not the case, and that she was merely reminding me. Obviously, then, she was in urgent need.
Section 6 of The Countess of Lowndes Square and Other Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jim's Vox 4. The Countess of Lowndes Square and Other Stories by E. F. Benson. General Stories, Chapter 3, In the Dark. Reginald Case, newly promoted to the rank of captain in the 43rd Native Cavalry of the Indian Army, was picking his way back to his bungalow by the light of a somewhat ill-burning lantern from the regimental mess-room where he had dined. It was early in July. The long-delayed rains had broken at Haziri in the central provinces 10 days before, and it was an imprudent man who would venture on a mere field path like this at night without some illumination for his steps, lest inadvertently he might tread on a meditative and deadly kite with murder behind its stale small eyes, or step on the black coils of some hooded cobra. Only a few days before, Case had found one such in the bathroom of his bungalow, curled up on the mat within a few inches of his bare foot, when he went there to bathe before dinner, and he had no desire to give his nerves any further test of steadiness under such circumstances. Today there had been a break in the prodigious deluge, and all the afternoon the midsummer sun had blazed from a clear sky, causing all vegetable things to sprout with magical rapidity. This path, which yesterday had been a bare track over the fields, was now covered with springing herbs. The parade ground, which for the last week had been but a sea of viscous mud, was clad in a mantle of delicate green blades, and the tamarisks and neem trees were studded with swelling buds among the dead and dripping foliage of the spring. A similar animation had tingled through the insect world, and as Case passed across the couple of fields that lay between the mess room and his bungalow, a swarm of evil flies dashed themselves against the glass of his lantern. Overhead, since sunset, the clouds had gathered densely again across the vault of the sky, but to the east an arch of clear and starlit.
Section 7 of the Countess of Lowndes Square and Other Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kate Follis. The Countess of Lowndes Square and Other Stories by E. F. Benson. General Stories, Chapter 4, The False Step. Mrs. Arthur Bolney Ross, when 3 years ago she set sail, or rather set screw, for England, had no very clear idea of the campaign she intended to wage there, though a firm determination to win it, and had mentally arrived at no general plan beyond those preliminary manoeuvres which our charming American invaders usually adopt when they first effect a landing on the primitive pavements of Piccadilly. She had, in fact, taken 6 rooms at the Ritz Hotel and a box on the grand tier of the Covent Garden Opera House, but she had also, for the 6 months preceding her expedition, secretly received daily lessons on the pronunciation and idioms of that particular, and as she thought, peculiar, dialect of the English language which was in vogue among the section of the English-speaking race with whom she intended to have dealings. Rightly or wrongly, she had decided that the screaming drawl of New York, which a few years before had so captivated the English upper classes, and had led to so many charming and successful marriages, was now out of date, and would enchant no longer. So instead of being content with her expressive native speech, she learned with almost passionate assiduity the mumbling English diction, the inaudible Victorian voice, which she rightly considered would be a novelty to those who had so largely abandoned it themselves in favour of a more strident utterance. But she did not, in mastering the Victorian voice and intonation, suffer her knowledge of her native tongue and its blatant delivery to wither from misuse. She but became bilingual, and schooled her vocal cords to either register, without in the least confusing the two. It was in this point that she showed herself a campaigner of no stereotyped order, but one who might go far, who intended, in any case, to go further than anybody else. The idea was brilliant. Others before her had become more English than the English, and had done well. Others had remained more American than the Americans, and had done even better. But she, among the immense bales of her luggage, brought with her the significant little handbag, so to speak. She could sound American or English at will. She could say without stumbling, "Very pleased to meet your acquaintance," or "How are you?" just as she pleased. And in this, so it seems to her historian, lay the germ of her success, and also the seeds of her final and irretrievable disaster. For, in spite of her modulated voice and acquired idiom, she remained American in thought, with the regal impulses of a queen in Newport. In other respects she was not, on her first landing, different in kind from our ordinary hospitable invaders. She had a real Arthur Bolney Ross in the background, who was capable of being shown and tested if, so to speak, she was searched, but who, since his mind had in the course of years become nothing more nor less than a mint, out of which streams of bouillon perpetually issued, preferred to be left alone for the processes of production. Amelie was excellent friends with him when they had time and inclination to meet, and it always gave her a comfortable feeling to know that Arthur was in existence. If they had met very often, it is probable that they would have got on each other's nerves, and, since she had an immense fortune of her own, have considered the desirability of a divorce. But in the meantime, Amelie decidedly liked the feeling of stability which her husband. Section 8 of the Countess of Lowndes Square and Other Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kate Follis. The Countess of Lowndes Square and Other Stories by E. F. Benson. Spook Stories. Chapter 1. The Case of Frank Hampden. There was a light visible from the chinks and crevices of drawn curtains in the window of Dr. Rupert's study as I passed it on my way back from dinner one night. He lived some 6 doors farther up the same street as I, and since it had long been a frequent custom for us to smoke the go-to-bed cigarette together, I rang and asked if he was at leisure. His servant told me that he had already sent a message across to my house, asking me to look in on him if I got home while the evening was not too far advanced for a casual conversational quarter of an hour. And accordingly, I took off my coat and went straight into the pleasant little front room, about which hung the studious fragrance of the books that lined it from floor to ceiling. Arthur Rupert was not alone this evening. There was, sitting on the near side of the fire, which sparkled prosperously in this clear night of early December frost, a young man whom I was sure I had never seen before. As I entered, he stopped in the middle of a sentence, turning towards the door, and I looked on the most handsome and diabolical face that I had ever beheld. Simultaneously, Rupert got up. "I hoped you would look in," he said. "Let me introduce you to my cousin, Mr. Hampden, who is spending a day or two with me. This is Mr. Archdale, Frank, of whom I was speaking just now." As the other rose, I saw that Rupert's almost foolishly amiable fox terrier shrank away from where she had been sitting by her master's chair, instead of giving me her accustomed and effusive greeting, and retreated into a far corner of the room, where she sat quivering with raised hackles, and with vigilant eyes full of hate and terror fixed on young Hampden. His right arm was in a sling, and he held out his left hand to me. "You must excuse me," he said, "but I am only just recovering from a broken arm. My cousin's dog doesn't approve of it. She would like to get her teeth into it." "The oddest thing I ever saw, Archdale," said Rupert. "You know Fifi's usual amiability. Call her, Frank." Frank Hampden whistled and clicked his fingers together in an encouraging manner. "Fifi, come here, Fifi," he said. For a moment I thought that this most confiding of ladies was going to fly at him, but apparently she could not find the courage for an attack, and snapping and growling, retreated behind the window curtains. "And that to me," said Hampden, licking his lips as he spoke. "Me, who adore dogs. Don't you, Mr. Archdale?" As he said that, I knew that he lied, that Fifi's detestation of him was met with a hatred quite as vivid, but more controlled. I can no more account for that.
Section 9 of The Countess of Lowndes Square and Other Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jim's Vox 4. The Countess of Lowndes Square and Other Stories by E. F. Benson. Spook Stories, Chapter 2, Mrs. Andrews' Control. Mrs. Andrews was certainly Athenian by nature, and it was her delight not only to hear some new thing, but to put it into practice. Enjoying excellent health, she was able to take almost any liberties with her constitution, and for a long time was absorbed in the maelstrom of diets, each of which seemed to suit her to perfection. For a couple of months she adopted the Pembroke treatment, and droves of sheep were sacrificed to supply her with sufficient minced mutton, while the utmost resources of the kitchen boiler were needed to give her the oceans of hot water which she found necessary to drink all day, except at meals. Having obtained the utmost benefits derivable from this system, she nourished her ample and vigorous frame, by way of a change, on pyramids of grated nuts carefully weighed out, and it cannot be doubted that she would enthusiastically have fed herself on chopped hard-boiled egg, like a canary, if she could have found any system of diet that inculcated such a proceeding. Her husband, for all his mild and apparently yielding disposition, must at bottom have been a man of iron soul, for he absolutely refused to embark on any of these experiments, though he never dissuaded his wife from doing so, and stuck firmly, like a limpet, to his 3 solid and satisfactory meals, not disdaining minced mutton, nor even a modicum of milled nuts when he felt that they would be agreeable, but adding them to his ordinary diet without relying on them. The two, childless and middle-aged, lived in extreme happiness and comfort together, and no doubt Mrs. Andrews' enthusiasms and the perennial amusement her husband derived from them served to keep the sunlight of life shining on them. They were never bored, and always busy, which perhaps, even more than diet, secured them serenity of health. But there came a time when Mrs. Andrews, in an unacknowledged despair of feeling better and more vigorous physically than she always did, turned her Athenian mind towards mental and psychical fads. She began by telling the fortunes of her friends by means of cards, and though she could always say how she knew, following the rules of her primer, that her husband had had scarlet fever when he was 23, yet the fact that she knew it perfectly well without the help of the cards made the divination rather less amazing. She tried Christian Science, though only for a short time, since no amount of demonstration over false claims could rid her one day of the conviction that she had a raging toothache, whereas the dentist convinced her in a moment, by the short though agonizing application of the pincers, that she could remove the toothache, which had resisted all the precepts of her temporary creed. An excursion into the realms of astrology succeeded this, and conjointly a study of palmistry, and at this point her husband, for the first time, began to take an interest in his wife's preoccupations.
Section 10 of the Countess of Lowndes Square and Other Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kate Follis. The Countess of Lowndes Square and Other Stories by E. F. Benson. Spook Stories, Chapter 3, The Ape. Hugh Marsham had spent the day, as a good tourist should, in visiting the temples and the tombs of the kings across the river, and the magic of the hour of sunset flamed over earth and heaven as he crossed the Nile again to Luxor in his felucca. It seemed as if the whole world had been suddenly transferred into the heart of an opal and burned with a myriad fiery colours. The river itself was of the green that beech trees are clad in at springtime. The columns of the temple that stood close to its banks glowed as if lit from within by the flame of some perpetual evening sacrifice. The cloudless sky was dusky blue in the east, the blue of turquoise overhead, and melted into aquamarine above the line of desert where the sun had just sunk. All along the bank, which he was fast approaching under the press of the cool wind from the north, were crowds of Arabs, padding softly home in the dust from their work, and chattering as sparrows chatter among the bushes in the long English twilights. Even the dust that hovered and hung and was dispersed again by the wind was rainbowed. It caught the hues from the river and the sky, and the orange flaming temple, and those who walked in it were clad in brightness. Here in the south no long English twilight lingered, and as he walked up the dusky fragrant tunnel of mimosa that led to the hotel, night thickened, and in the sky a million stars leaped into being, while the soft gathering darkness sponged out the glories of the flaming hour. On the hotel steps the vendors of carpets and Arabian hangings, of incense and filigree work, of suspicious turquoises, and more than suspicious scarabs, were already packing up their wares, and probably recounting to each other in their shrill, incomprehensible gabble the iniquitous bargains they had made with the gullible Americans and English who so innocently purchased the wares of Manchester. Only in his accustomed corner old Abdul still squatted, for he was of a class above the ordinary vendors, a substantial dealer in antiques, who had a shop in the village, where archaeologists resorted and bought sub rosa, pieces that eventually found their way into European museums. He was in his shop all day, but evening found him, when serious business hours were over, on the steps of the hotel, where he sold undoubted antiquities to tourists who wanted something genuine. The day had been very hot, and Hugh felt himself disposed to linger outside the hotel in this cool dusk, and turn over the tray of scarabs which Abdul Hamid presented to his notice. He was a wrinkled, dried-up husk of a man, loquacious and ingratiating in manner, and welcomed Hugh as an old customer. "See, sir," he said, "here are 2 more scroll scarabs." Section 11 of the Countess of Lowndes Square and Other Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kate Follis. The Countess of Lowndes Square and Other Stories by E. F. Benson. Spook Stories, Chapter 4, Through. Richard Waghorn was among the cleverest and most popular of professional mediums, and a never-failing source of consolation to the credulous. That there was fraud, downright unadulterated fraud, mixed up with his remarkable manifestations, it would be impossible to deny, but it would have been futile not to admit that these manifestations were not wholly fraudulent. He had, to an extraordinary degree, that rare and inexplicable gift of tapping, so to speak, not only the surface consciousness of those who consulted him, but, in favourable circumstances, their inner or subliminal selves, so that it frequently happened that he could speak to an inquirer of something he had completely forgotten, which subsequent investigation proved to be authentic. So much was perfectly genuine, but he gave, as it were, a false frame to it all by the manner in which he presented these phenomena. He pretended, at his séances, to go into a trance, during which he was controlled sometimes by the spirit of an ancient Egyptian priest, who gave news to the inquirer about some dead friend or relative, sometimes more directly by that dead friend or relative who spoke through him. As a matter of fact, Waghorn would not be in a trance at all, but perfectly conscious, extracting, as he sat, quiescent and with closed eyes, the knowledge, remembered or even forgotten, that lurked in the mind of his sitter, and bringing it out in the speech of Mentu, the Egyptian control, or of the lost friend or relative about whom inquiry was being made. Fraudulent also, as purporting to come from the intelligence of discarnate spirits, were the pieces of information he gave as to the conditions under which those who had passed over still lived, and it was here that he chiefly brought consolation to the credulous, for he represented the dead as happy and busy and full of spiritual activities. This information, to speak frankly, he obtained entirely from his own conscious mind. He made it up, and we cannot really find an excuse for him in the undoubted fact that he sincerely believed in the general truth of all he said when he spoke of the survival of individual personality. Finally, deeply dyed with fraud, and that in crude garish colours, were the spirit rappings, the playing of musical boxes, the appearance of materialized spirits, the smell of incense that heralded Cardinal Newman, all that bag of conjuring tricks, in fact, which disgraces and makes a laughing stock of the impostors who profess to be able to bring the seen world into connection with the unseen world. But to do Waghorn justice, he did not often employ those crude contrivances, for his telepathic and thought-reading gifts were far more convincing to his sitters. Occasionally, however, his powers in this line used to fail him, and then, it must be confessed, he presented his Egyptian control with every trapping and circumstance of degrading device. Such was the general scheme of procedure when Richard Waghorn, with his sister as accomplice in case mechanical tricks were necessary, undertook to reveal the spirit world to the material world. They were a pleasant, handsome pair of young people, gifted with a manner that, if anything, disarmed suspicion too much, and while feudal old gentlemen found it quite agreeable to sit in the dark, holding Julia's firm, cool hand, similarly constituted old ladies were the recipients of thrilling emotions when they held Richard's, the touch of which they declared was strangely electric. There they sat, while Richard, breathing deeply and moaning in his simulated trance, was the mouthpiece of Mentu, and told them things which, but for his indubitable gift of thought-reading, it was impossible for him to know, or, if the power was not coming through properly, they listened, hardly less thrilled, to spirit rappings and musical boxes and unverifiable information about the conditions of life where the mortal coil hampers no longer. It was all very interesting and soothing and edifying. And then, one day, there occurred an eruption of something wholly unexpected and inexplicable. Brother and sister were dining quietly after a busy but unsatisfactory day when the tinkling summons came from the telephone, and Richard found that a loud voice, belonging, so it said, to Mrs. Gardner, wanted to arrange a sitting alone for next day. No address was given, but he made an appointment for 2:30, and without much enthusiasm went back to his dinner. "A stranger," he said to his sister, "with no address and no reference or introduction. I hope I shall be in better form tomorrow. There was nothing but rappings and music today. They are boring, and also they are dangerous, for one may be detected at any time, and I got an infernal blow on my knuckles from that new electric tapper." Julia laughed. "I know, I heard it," she said. "There was quite a wrong noise in one of the taps as we were spelling out Silver Wing." He lit his cigarette, frowning at the smoke. "That's the worst of my profession," he said. "On some days I can get quite right inside the mind of the sitter, and, as you know, bring out the most surprising information. But on other days, today, for instance, and there have been many such lately, there's a mere blank wall in front of me. I shall lose my position if it happens often. Nobody will pay my fees only to hear spirit rappings and generalities." "They're better than nothing," said Julia. "Very little. They help to fill up, but I hate using them. Don't you remember, when we began investigating, just you and I alone, how often we seemed on the verge of genuine supernatural manifestations? They appeared to be just round the corner." "Yes, but we never turned the corner. We never got beyond mere thought-reading." He got up. I know we didn't, but there always seemed a possibility. The door was ajar. It wasn't locked, and it has never ceased to be ajar. Often when the mere thought-reading, as you call it, is flowing along most smoothly, I feel that if only I could abandon my whole consciousness a little more completely, somebody would really take control of me. I wish it would, and yet I'm frightened of it. It might revenge itself for all the frauds I've perpetrated in its name. Come, let's play piquet and forget about it all." It was settled that Julia should be present next day when the stranger came for her sitting, in order that if Richard's thought-reading was not coming through any better than it had done lately, she should help in the wrappings, and the luminous patches and the musical box. Mrs. Gardner was punctual to her appointment, a tall, quiet, well-dressed woman, who stated with the perfect frankness her object in wishing for a séance, and her views about spirit communication. "I should immensely like to believe in spirit communication," she said, "such as I am told you are capable of producing, but at present I don't." "It is important that the atmosphere should not be one of hostility," said Waghorn in his dreamy professional manner. "I bring no hostility," she said. "I am in a state, shall we say, of benevolent neutrality, unless," and she smiled in a charming manner, "unless benevolent neutrality has come to mean malevolent hostility. That, I assure you, is not the case with me. I want to believe." She paused a moment. "And may I say this without offence?" she asked. "May I tell you that spirit rappings and curious lights and sounds of music do not interest me in the least?" They were already seated in the room where the séance was to be held. The windows were thickly curtained. There was only a glimmer of light from the red lamp, and even this the spirits would very likely desire to have extinguished. If this visitor took no interest in such things, Waghorn felt that he and his sister had wasted their time in adjusting the electric hammer, made to rap by the pressure of the foot on a switch concealed in the thick rug underneath the table, behind the sliding panel, in stringing across the ceiling the invisible wires on which the luminous globes ran, and in making ready all the auxiliary paraphernalia in case the genuine telepathy was not on tap. So, with voice dreamier than before, and with slower utterance, as he was supposed to be beginning to sink into trance, he just said, "I can't foretell the manner in which they may choose to make their presence known." He gave one loud rap, which perfectly conveyed the word "no" to his sister, indicating that the conjuring tricks were not to be used. Subsequently, if really necessary, he could rap "yes" to her, and the music and the magic lights would be displayed. Then he began to breathe quickly and in a snorting manner, to show that the control was taking possession of him. "My brother is going into trance very quickly," said Julia, and there was dead silence. Almost immediately a clear and shining lucidity spread like sunshine after these days of cloud over Waghorn's brain. Every moment he found himself knowing more and more about this complete stranger who sat with hand touching his. He felt his subconscious brain, which had lately lain befogged and imperceptive, sun itself under the brilliant clarity of illumination that had come to it, and in the impressive bass in which Mentu was wont to give vent to his revelations, he said, "I am here. Mentu is here." He felt the table rocking beneath his hands, which surprised him, since he had exerted no pressure on it, and he supposed that Julia had not understood his signal, and was beginning the conjuring tricks. One hand of his was in hers, and by the pressure of his fingertips he conveyed to her in code, "Don't do it." Instantly she answered back, "I wasn't." He paid no more heed to that, though the table continued to oscillate and tip up in a very curious manner, for his mind was steeped in this flood of images that impressed themselves on his brain. "What shall Mentu tell you to-day?" he went on, with pauses between the sentences. "Someone has come to consult Mentu. It is a lady. I can see her. She wears a locket round her neck, below her coat, with a piece of black hair and a glass between the gold." He felt a slight jerk from Mrs. Gardner's hand, and in fingertip code said to Julia, "Ask her." Julia whispered across the table, "Is that so?" "Yes," said Mrs. Gardner, and Waghorn heard her take her breath quickly. He just remembered that she was not in mourning, but that made no difference. He knew, not guessing, that Mrs. Gardner wished to know something from the man or woman on whose head that hair once grew, which was contained in the locket that rested unseen below her buttoned jacket. Then the next moment he knew also that this was a man's hair. Thereafter the flood of sun and precise mental impressions poured over him in spate of bright waters. "She wants to know about the boy whose hair is in the locket. He's not a boy now. He is, according to Earth's eyes, a grown man. There's a D. I see a D. Not Dick, not David. There is a Y. It is Dennis, not Saint Denis, not French, English Denis. Denis Bristow." He paused a moment and heard Mrs. Gardner whisper, "Yes, that is right." Waghorn gave vent to Mentu's jovial laugh. "She says it is right," he said. "How should not Mentu be right? Perhaps Mentu is right, too, when he says that Dennis is her brother. Yes, that is Margaret Bristow who sits here, though not Margaret Bristow now. Margaret." Waghorn saw the name quite clearly, but yet he hesitated. It was not Gardner at all. Then it struck him for the first time that nothing was more likely than that Mrs. Gardner had adopted a pseudonym. He went on, "Margaret Forsyth is Dennis's sister. Margaret wants to know about Dennis. Dennis is coming. He will be here in a moment. He has spoken of his sister before. He did not call her Margaret. He called her He called her Queenie. Will Queenie speak?" Waghorn felt the trembling of her hand. He heard her twice try to speak, but she was unable to control the trembling in her voice. "Can Dennis speak to me?" she said in a whisper. "Can he really come here?" Up to this moment Waghorn had been enjoying himself immensely, for after the days in which he had been unable to get into touch with this rare and marvellous gifts of consciousness reading, it was blissful to find his mastery again, and besieged with the images which Margaret Forsyth's contact revealed to him. He had been producing them in Mentu's impressive voice, revelling in his restored powers. Her mind lay open to him like a book. He could read where he liked on pages familiar to her and on pages which had remained long unturned. But at this moment, as sudden as some qualm of sickness, he was aware of a startling change in the quality of his perceptions. Fresh knowledge of Dennis Bristow came into his mind, but he felt that it was not coming from her, but from some other source. Some odd buzzing sang in his ears, as when an anaesthetic begins to take effect, and opening his eyes he thought he saw a strange patch of light, inconsistent with the faint illumination of the red lamp, hovering over his breast. At the same moment he heard, though dimly, for his head was full of confused noise, the violent rapping of the electric hammer, and already only half conscious, felt an impotent irritation with his sister for employing these tricks. He struggled with the oncoming of the paralysis that was swiftly invading his mind and his physical being, but he struggled in vain, and next moment, overwhelmed with the onrush of a huge enveloping blackness, he lost consciousness altogether. The trance that he had often simulated had invaded him, and he knew nothing more. He came to himself again with the feeling that he had been recalled from some vast distance. Still unable to move, he sat listening to the quick panting of his own breath before he realized what the noise was. His face, from which the sweat poured in streams, rested on something cold and hard, and presently, when he opened his eyes, he saw that his head had fallen forward upon the table. He felt utterly exhausted, and yet somehow strangely satisfied. Some amazing thing had happened. Then, as he recovered himself, he began to remember that he had been reading Mrs. Gardner's or Mrs. Forsyth's mind, when some power external to himself took possession of him, and on his left he heard Julia's voice speaking very familiar words. "He's coming out of his trance," she said. "He will be himself again in a moment now." With a sense of great weariness he raised his head, disengaged his hands from those of the two women, and sank back in his chair. "Draw back the curtains," he said to Julia, "and open the window. I'm suffocating." She did as he told her, and he saw the red rays of the sun near to its setting pour into the room, while the breeze of sunset refreshed the air. On his right still sat Mrs. Forsyth, wiping her eyes and smiling at him, and having opened the window, Julia came back to the table, looking at him with a curious, anxious intentness. Then Mrs. Forsyth spoke. "It has been too marvellous," she said. "I cannot thank you enough. I will do exactly as you, or rather Dennis, told me about the test, and if it is right, I will certainly leave my house tomorrow, taking my servants with me." It was so like Dennis to think of them too. To Waghorn this meant nothing whatever. She might have been speaking Hebrew to him, but Julia, as she often did, answered for him. "My brother knows nothing of what happened in his trance," she said. Mrs. Forsyth got up. "I will go straight home," she said. "I feel sure that I shall find just what Dennis described. May I telephone to you about it at once?" "Yes, pray do," said Julia. "We shall be most anxious to hear." Richard got up to show her out, but having regained his feet he staggered and collapsed into his chair again. Mrs. Forsyth would not hear of his attempting to move just yet, and Julia, having taken her to the door, returned to her brother. It was usual for him, when the sitting was over, to feign great exhaustion, but the realism of his acting today had almost deceived her into thinking that something not yet experienced in their séances had occurred. Besides, he had said such strange, detailed, and extraordinary things. He was still where she had left him, and there could be no reason, now that they were alone, to keep up this feigned languor. "Dick," she said, "what's the matter? And what happened? I couldn't understand you at all. Why did you say all those things?" He stirred and sat up. "I'm better," he said, "and it is you who have to tell me what happened. I remember up to a certain point, and after that I lost consciousness completely. I remember thinking you were rocking the table, and I told you not to." "Yes, but I wasn't rocking it. I thought you were." "Well, it was neither of us then," said he. "I was vexed because Mrs. Mrs. Forsyth, had said she didn't want that sort of thing, and I was reading her as I never read anyone before. I told her about the locket and the black hair. I got her brother's name. I got her name and her nickname Queenie. Then she asked if Dennis could really come, and at that moment something began to take possession of me. I think I saw a light, as usual, over my breast, and I think I heard a tremendous rapping. Did you do either of those, or did they really happen?" Julia stared at him for a moment in silence. "I did neither of those," she said, "but they happened. You must have pressed the breast pocket switch and trod on the switch of the hammer." He opened his coat. "I had not got the breast pocket switch," he said, "and I certainly did not tread on the hammer switch." Julia moved her chair a little closer to him. "The hammer did not sound right," she said. "It was 10 times louder than I have ever heard, and the light was quite different somehow. It was much brighter. I could see everything in the room quite distinctly. Go on, Dick." "I can't. That's all I know until I came to, leaning over the table and bathed in perspiration. Tell me what happened." "Dick, do you swear that is true?" she asked. "Certainly I do. Go on." "The light grew, and then faded again to a glimmer," she said. "And then suddenly you began to talk in a different voice. It wasn't meant to any longer. Mrs. Forsythe recognized it instantly, and I thought what wonderful luck it was that you should have hit on a voice that was like her brother's. Then it and she had a long talk. It must have lasted half an hour. They reminded each other how Dennis had come to live with her and her husband on their father's death. He was only 18 at the time and still at school. He was killed in a street accident, being run over by a bicycle 2 days before her birthday. All this was correct, and I thought I never heard you mind reading so clearly and quickly. You hardly paused at all." Julia was silent a moment. "Dick, don't you really know what followed?" she asked. "Not in the smallest degree," he said. "Well, I thought you had gone mad," she said. "Mrs. Forsythe asked for a test, something that was not known to her and had never been known to her, and you gave it instantly. You laughed, Dennis laughed, the voice that spoke laughed, and told her to look behind the row of books beside the bed in the room that was still known as Dennis's room, and she would find tucked away a little cardboard box with a gold safety pin set with a pearl. He had bought it for her birthday present and had hidden it there till the day came. He was killed, as I told you, 2 days before. And she, half sobbing, half laughing, said, 'Oh, Dennis, how deliciously secretive you used to be.'" "And is that what she's going to telephone about?" asked Waghorn. "Yes, Dick. What made you say all that?" "I didn't know, I tell you. I didn't know I said it. And was that all? She said something about leaving her house tomorrow and taking the servants. What did that mean?" "You got very much distressed. You told her she was in danger. You said—" Julia paused again. "You said there was something coming, fire from the clouds and a rending. You said her country house, which I gathered was down somewhere near Epping, would be burst open by the fire from the clouds tomorrow night. You made her promise to leave it and take the servants with her. You said her husband was away, which again is the case, and she asked if you meant Zeppelins, and you said you did." Waghorn suddenly got up. "You meant, you said, you did," he cried. "What if it's he meant, he said, he did?" "It's impossible," she said. "Good Lord, what's impossible?" he asked. "What if I really am that which I have so long pretended to be? What if I am a medium, one who is the mysterious bridge between the quick and the dead? I'm frightened, but I'm bound to say I'm horribly interested. All that you tell me I said when I was in a trance never came out of Mrs. Forsythe's mind. It wasn't there. She didn't know about the pearl pin. She had never known it, nor had I ever known it. Where did it come from, then? Only one person knew, the boy who died 10 years ago." "It yet remains to be seen whether it is true," said she. We shall know in an hour or two, for she is motoring straight down to her house in the country." "And if it turns out to be true, who was talking?" said he. The sunset faded into the dusk of the clear May evening, and the two still sat there waiting for the telephone to inform them whether the door, which, as Waghorn had said, had seemed so often ajar and never quite closed, was now thrown open, and light and intelligence from another world had shone on his unconscious mind. Presently the tinkling summons came, and with an eager curiosity, below which lurked that fear of the unknown, the dim, mysterious land into which all human creatures pass across the closed frontier, he went to hear what news awaited him. "Trunk call," said the operator, and he listened. Soon the voice came through. "Mr. Waghorn," it said. "Yes." "I have found the box, and exactly the place described. It contained what we had been told it would contain. I shall leave the house, taking all the servants away, tomorrow." 2 mornings later, the papers contained news of a Zeppelin raid during the night on certain eastern counties. The details given were vague and meagre, and no names of towns or villages where bombs had been dropped were vouchsafed to the public. But later in the day, private information came to Waghorn that Forsyth Hall, near Epping, had been completely wrecked. No lives, luckily, were lost, for the house was empty. End of section 11.
Section 12 of the Countess of Lowndes Square and Other Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Devora Allen. The Countess of Lowndes Square and Other Stories by E. F. Benson. Cat Stories, Chapter 1. Pusscat. It was during the month of May, some 9 years ago, that the beginning of the events that concerned Pusscat took place. I was living at the time on the green outskirts of a country town, and my dining room at the back of the house opened on to a small garden framed in brick walls some 5 feet high. Breakfasting there one morning, I saw a large black and white cat, with a sharp but serious face, observing me with studied attention. Now at the time there was an interregnum, and my house was without a mistress, in the shape of a cat, and it at once struck me that I was being interviewed by this big and pleasing stranger to see if I would do. So, since there is nothing that a prospective mistress likes less than premature familiarity on the part of the householder whom she may be thinking of engaging, I took no direct notice of the cat, but continued to eat my breakfast carefully and tidily. After a short inspection, the cat quietly withdrew without once looking back, and I supposed that I was dismissed, or that she had decided after all to keep on her present household. In that I proved to be mistaken. She had only gone away to think about it, and next morning, and for several mornings after that, I was subjected to the same embarrassing but not unfriendly scrutiny. After which she took a stroll round the garden to see if there were any flower beds that would do to make ambushes in, and a convenient tree or two to climb should emergencies arise. On the 4th day, as far as I remember, I committed an error, and halfway through breakfast went out into the garden, to attempt to get on more familiar terms. The cat regarded me for a few moments with pained surprise, and went away. But after I had gone in again, she decided to overlook it, for she returned to her former place and continued to observe. Next morning she made up her mind, jumped down from the wall, trotted across the grass, entered the dining room, and, arranging herself in a great hurry round one hind leg, which she put up in the air like a flagstaff, proceeded to make her morning toilette. That, as I knew quite well, meant that she thought I would give satisfaction, and I was therefore permitted to enter upon my duties at once. So I put down a saucer of milk for her, which she very obligingly disposed of. Then she went and sat by the door and said, "Ah," to show that she wished the door to be opened for her, so that she might inspect the rest of the house. So I called down the kitchen stairs, "There is come a cat, who I think means to stop. Don't fuss her." In this manner the real pusscat, though I did not know that, entered the house. Now here I must make a short defence for my share in these things. I might, by a hasty judgment, be considered to have stolen her who soon became Puss Cat's mamma. But anyone who has a real knowledge of cats will be aware that I did nothing of the kind. Puss Cat's mamma was clearly dissatisfied with her last household, and had, without the least doubt, made up her mind to leave them all and take on a fresh lot of servants. And if a cat makes up her mind about anything, no power on earth except death, or permanent confinement in a room where neither doors nor windows are ever opened, will stop her taking the contemplated step. If her last, unknown household killed her, or permanently shut her up, of course, she could not engage fresh people, but short of that they were powerless to keep her. You may cajole or bully a dog into doing what you want, but no manner of persuasion will cause a cat to deviate one hair's breadth from the course she means to pursue. If I had driven her away, she would have gone to another house, but never back to her own. For though we may own dogs and horses and other animals, it is a great mistake to think that we own cats. Cats employ us, and if we give satisfaction they may go so far as to adopt us. Besides, Puss Cat's mamma did not, as it turned out, mean to stay with me altogether. She only wanted quiet lodgings for a time. So our new mistress went discreetly downstairs and inspected kitchen, scullery, and pantry. She spent some time in the scullery, so I was told, and felt rather doubtful. But she quite liked the new gas stove in the kitchen, and singed her tail at it, as nobody had told her that lunch was a-cooking. Also she found a mouse-hole below the wainscoting, which appeared to decide her, for, as we soon found out, she liked work. And she trotted upstairs again, and sat outside the drawing-room door till somebody opened it for her. I happened to be inside, with Jill, a young lady of the fox-terrier breed, and of course did not know that Puss Cat's mamma was waiting. Eventually I came out and saw her sitting there. Jill saw her too, and eagerly ran up to her, only to talk, not to fight, for Jill likes cats. But Puss Cat's mamma did not know that, so just in case, she slapped Jill smartly first on one side of the head and then on the other. She was not angry, but only firm and strong, and wished that from the first there should be no doubt whatever about her position. Having done that, she allowed Jill to explain, which Jill did with twitchings of her stumpy tail and attitude provocative of gambols. And before many minutes were up, Puss Cat's mamma was kind enough to play with her. Then she suddenly remembered that she had not seen the rest of the house, and went upstairs, where she remained till lunch-time. It was the manner in which she spent the first morning that gave me the key to the character of Puss Cat's mamma, and we at once settled that her name had always been Martha. She had annexed our house, it is true, but in no grabbing or belligerent spirit, but simply because she had seen from her post on the garden wall that we wanted somebody to look after us and manage the house, and she could not help knowing how wonderful she was in all things connected with the mistress's duties. Every morning when the housemaid's step was heard on the stairs during breakfast, she had a very audible step, Martha, even in the middle of fish or milk, ran to the door, said, "Ah!" till it was opened, and rushed after her, sitting in each bedroom in turn to see that the slops were properly emptied and the beds well and truly made. In the middle of such supervision, sometimes came other calls upon her. The front door-bell would ring, and Martha had to hurry down to see that the door was nicely opened. Then perhaps she would catch sight of somebody digging in the garden, and she was forced to go out in this busiest time of the morning to dab at the turned-up earth in order to be sure that it was fresh. In particular, I remember the day on which the dining-room was repapered. She had to climb the step-ladder to ascertain if it was safe, and sit on the top to clean herself. Then each roll of paper had to be judged by the smell, and the paste to be touched with the end of a pink tongue. That made her sneeze, which must be the right test for paste, and she allowed it to be used. That day we lunched in the drawing-room, and it is easy to imagine how busy Martha was, for the proceeding was very irregular, and she could not tell how it would turn out. Meal-times were always busy. She had to walk in front of every dish as it was brought in, and precede it as it was taken out. And today these duties were complicated by the necessity of going back constantly to the real dining-room to see that the paper-hangers were not idling. To make the rush more overpowering, Jill was in the garden wanting to play, and to play with Jill was one of Martha's duties. And some young hollyhocks were being put in, certain of which, for inscrutable reasons, had to be dug up again with strong backward kicks of the hind legs. She had settled that there was but one cat, which was of course herself. Occasionally alien heads looked over the wall, and the cries of strangers sounded. Whenever that happened, Whatever the stress of housework might be, Martha bounded from house into garden to expel and, if possible, kill the intruder. Once from my bedroom window I saw a terrific affair. Martha had been sitting as good as gold among hairbrushes and nail scissors, showing me how to shave, when something feline moving in the garden caught her eye. Not waiting for the door to be opened, she made one leap of it out of the window into the apple tree, and whirled down the trunk, even as lightning strikes and rips its way to the ground. And next moment I saw her, with paw uplifted, tearing tufts of fur from the next door tabby. She was like one of those amazing Chinese grotesques, half cat, half demon, and wholly warrior. Shrill cries rent the peaceful morning air, and Martha, intoxicated with vengeance, allowed the mishandled tabby to escape. Then, with awesome face and bacchanalian eye, she ate the tufts of blood-stained fur, rolling them on her tongue and swallowing them with obvious difficulty, as if performing some terrible, antique, and cannibalistic rite. And all this from a lady who was so shortly to be confined. But it was no use trying to keep Martha quiet. A second minute inspection of her house was necessary before she decided which should be the birth-chamber. She spent a long time in the woodshed that morning, and we hoped that it was going to be there. She spent a long time in the bathroom, and we hoped it wasn't. Eventually she settled on the pantry, and when she had quite made up her mind, we made her comfortable. Next morning, 3 dappled little blind things were there. She ate one, for no reason as far as we could judge, but that she was afraid that Jill wanted to. So, as it was her kitten, not Jill's, she ate it. With all respect for Martha, I think that here she had mistaken her vocation. She should never have gone in for being a mother. The second kitten she lay down upon with fatal results. Then, being thoroughly disgusted with maternity, she went away, and never was seen any more. She deserted the only child she had not killed. She deserted us, who had tried so hard to give satisfaction, and in the basket there was left, still blind, still uncertain whether it was worth while to live at all, Pusscat. Pusscat was her mother's own child from the first, though with much added. She wasted no time or strength in bewailing her orphaned condition, but took amazing quantities of milk administered on a feather. Her eyes opened, as eyes should do, on the 7th day, and she smiled at us all, and spat at Jill. So Jill licked her nose with anxious care, and said quite distinctly, "When you are a little older, I will be always ready to do whatever you like." Jill says the same sort of thing to everybody, except the dustmen. Soon after, Pusscat arose from her birth-bed, and staggered across the pantry. Even this first expedition on her own feet was not made without purpose, for in spite of frequent falls, she went straight up to a blind tassel, and after looking at it for a long time, tested it with a tiny paw to make sure of it, thus showing, while scarcely out of the cradle, that serious purpose which marked her throughout her dear life. Her motto was, "Do your work," and since she remained unmarried in spite of very many eligible offers, I think that her unnatural mother must have impressed upon her, in those few days before she deserted her, that the first duty of a cat is to look after the house, and that she herself didn't think much of maternity. Pusscat inherited also, I suppose, her fixed conviction that she ought to have been, even if she was not, the only cat in the world, and she would allow no one of her own race within eye-shot of house or garden. Some of her duties, though they were always conscientiously performed, I think rather bored her, but certainly she brought to the expulsion of cats an exquisite sense of enjoyment. On the appearance of any one of her own nation, she would go hastily into ambush with twitching tail and jerking shoulder-blades, teasing and torturing herself with the postponement of that rapturous, stealthy advance across the grass, if the quarry was looking the other way, or the furious hurling of herself through the air, if a frontal attack had to be delivered. And I often wondered that she did not betray her ambush by the rapture and sonorousness of her purring, as the supreme moment approached. Jill, I am afraid, gave her a lot of worry over this duty of the expulsion of aliens, for Jill would sooner play with an alien than expel it, and her plan was to gambol up to the intruder with misplaced welcome. It is true that the effect was just the same, because a trespassing cat, seeing an alert fox terrier rapidly approaching, seldom, if ever, stops to play, so that Jill's method was really quite effective too. But Pusscat had high moral purpose behind her. She wanted not only to expel, but to appall and injure, and like many moralists of our own species, she enjoyed her fulminations and onslaughts quite tremendously. She liked punishing other cats, because she was right and they were wrong, and vigorous kicks and bites would help them perhaps to understand that. But though Puss-cat resembled her mother in the matter of the high sense of duty and moral qualities, she had what Martha lacked, that indefinable attraction which we call charm, and a great heart. She was always pleased and affectionate, and went about her duties with as near an approach to a smile as is possible for the gravest species of animal. Martha, for instance, played with Jill as a part of her duty. Puss-cat made a pleasure out of it, and played with the ecstatic abandon of a child. Indeed, I have known her put dinner a quarter of an hour later, because she was in the lovely jungle of long grass at the end of the garden, and was preparing to give Jill an awful fright. This business of the jungle deserves mention, not because it was so remarkable in itself, but because it was so wonderful to Puss-cat. The jungle in question was a space of some dozen yards, where in spring daffodils grew in clumps of sunshine, and fritillaries hung their speckled bells. There were peonies also planted in the grass, and a briar rose, and an apple tree. Nothing, as I have said, was remarkable in itself, but it was fraught with amazing possibilities to the keen imagination of Puss-cat. At the bottom of this strip of untamed jungle the lawn began, and it was one of Puss-cat's plans to hide at the edge of the jungle, flattening herself out till she looked like a shadow of something else. If luck served her, Jill, sooner or later, in the pursuit of interesting smells, would pass close to the edge of the jungle without seeing her. The moment Jill had gone by, Puss-cat would stretch out a discreet paw, and just touch Jill on the hindquarters. Jill, of course, had to turn round to see what this inexplicable thing meant, and on the moment Puss-cat would fling herself into the air and descend tiger-like on Jill's back. That was the beginning of the game, and it contained more vicissitudes than a round of golf. There were ambushes and scurryings innumerable, assaults from the apple-tree, repulsions from behind the garden-roller, periods of absolute quiescence, suddenly and wildly broken by swift flanking movements through the sweet-peas, and at the end a failure of wind and limb, and Jill would lie panting on the bank, and Puss-cat, having put off dinner, proceeded to clean herself for her evening duties. She had to be smart at dinner-time, whether we were dining alone, or whether there was a dinner-party, for she was never a tea-gowned cat, and she dressed for her dinner, even if we were dining out. She was not responsible for that. What she was responsible for was to be tidy herself. Puss-cat, without doubt, was a plain kitten, but again, like many children of our own inferior race, she grew up to be a very handsome cat. With great chic, she did not attempt colours, but was pure black and white. Across her broad, strong back there was a black saddle, but the saddle, so to speak, had slewed round and made a black band across her left side. There was an arbitrary patch of black, too, on her left cheek, a black band on her tail, and a black tip to it. Otherwise she was pure white, except when she put out a pink tongue below her long, snowy whiskers. But her charm, the outstanding feature of Puss-cat, was independent of this fascinating colouring. Martha, for instance, had been content that dishes were carried into the dining-room and subsequently carried out. That and no more was her notion of her duties towards dinner. But Puss-cat really began where Martha ended. Like her, she preceded the soup, but when those who were present had received their share, she always went round with loud purrings to each guest, to congratulate them and hope that they liked it. For this process, which was repeated with every dish, she had a particular walk, stepping high and treading on the tips of her toes. This congratulatory march was purely altruistic. She did not want soup herself, she was only glad that other people had got it. Then when fish came, or bird, she would make her congratulatory tour just the same, and then sit firmly down and say she would like some too. Occasionally she favoured some particular guest with marked regard, and sometimes almost forgot her duties as mistress of the house, choosing rather to sit by her protégé and purr loudly, so that a dish would already be half eaten before she went her round to see that everyone was pleased with his portion. Finally, when coffee was brought, she went downstairs to the kitchen and retired for the night, usually sharing Jill's basket, where they lay together in a soft, slow-breathing heap of black and white. Puss-cat, like the ancient Greeks, was never sick or sorry. Never sick, because of her robust and stalwart health. Never sorry, because she never did anything to be sorry for. From living with Jill, and never seeing a cat, except for those short and painful interviews which preceded expulsion from the garden, she grew to have something of the selfless affection of a dog. And when I came home after an absence, she would run out into the street to meet me, stiff-tailed, and really not attending to the debarkation of luggage, but intent only on welcoming me home. 8 busy, happy years passed thus, and then one bitter February morning, Pussycat disappeared. The weeks went on, and still there came no sign of her, and when winter had passed into May, I gave up all hopes of her return, and got a fresh cat, this time a young blue Persian with topaz-coloured eyes. Another month went by, and Agag, so called from his delicate walk, had established himself in our affections on account of his extraordinary beauty, rather than from any charm of character, when the second act of the tragedy opened. I was sitting at breakfast one morning, with the door into the garden thrown wide, and Agag was curled up on a chair in the window, for unlike Pusscat and Martha, he did no housework at all, being of proud and aristocratic descent, when I saw coming slowly across the lawn a cat that I scarcely recognized. It was lean to the point of emaciation, its fur was disordered and dirty, but it was Pusscat, come home again. Then suddenly she saw me, and with a little cry of joy ran towards the open door. Then she saw Agag, and weak and thin as she was, she woke at once to her old sense of duty, and bounded on to his chair. Never before in her time had a cat got right into the house, and such a thing she felt determined should not occur again. Round the room and out into the garden raged the battle before I could separate them, Pusscat inspired by her sense of duty, Agag angry and astonished at this assault of a mere gutter cat in his own house. At last I got hold of Pusscat, and took her up in my arms, while Agag cursed and swore in justifiable indignation, for how could he tell that this was Pusscat? They never fought again, but it was a miserable fortnight that followed, and all the misery was poor Pusscat's. Agag, in spite of his beauty, had no heart, and did not mind how many cats I kept, so long as they did not molest him, or usurp his food or his cushion. But Pusscat, though she understood that for some inscrutable reason she had to share her house with Agag and not fight him, was a creature of strong affections, and her poor little soul was torn with agonies of jealousy. Jill, it is true, who was always treated with contemptuous unconsciousness by Agag, was certainly pleased to see her friend again, and had not forgotten her. But Pusscat wanted so much more than Jill could give her. She took on her old duties at once, but often when she escorted the fish into the dining-room, and found Agag asleep on his chair, she would be literally unable to go through with them, and would sit in a corner by herself, looking miserably and uncomprehendingly at me. Then perhaps the smell of fish would wake up Agag, and he would stretch himself and stand for a moment with superbly arched back on his chair, before he jumped down, and with loud purrings rubbed himself against the legs of my chair to betoken his desire for food, or even would jump up onto my knees. That was the worst of all for Pusscat, and she would often sit all dinner through in her remote corner, refusing food, and unable to take her eyes off the object of her jealousy. While Agag was present, no amount of caresses or attentions offered to her would console her, so that, when Agag had eaten, we usually turned him out of the room. Then for a little while Pusscat had respite from her Promethean vulture. She would go her rounds again to see that everybody was pleased, and escort fresh dishes in with high-stepping walk and erect tail. We hoped, foolishly perhaps, that in course of time the two would become friends, else I think I should have at once tried to find another home for Agag. But indeed, short of that, we did all we could do, lavishing attentions on dear Pusscat, and trying to make her feel, which indeed was true, that we all loved her, and only liked and admired Agag. But while we still hoped, Pusscat had had more than she could bear, and once again she disappeared. Jill missed her for a little while, Agag not at all, but the rest of us miss her still. End of section 12. Section 13 of the Countess of Lowndes Square and Other Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Devorah Allen. The Countess of Lowndes Square and Other Stories by E. F. Benson. Cat Stories, Chapter 2. There Arose a King. Agag, though of undoubtedly royal blood, was never a real king. He was no more than one of the Hyksos, a shepherd king, bound by the limitations of his race, and no partaker in its magnificence. Naturally, He did not work, as the late housekeeper had done, and no one expected that of him. But he had neither the splendour nor the vivacity possessed, let us say, by Henry VIII. Or George IV. To make up for his indolence in affairs of state. Henry VIII, anyhow, busied himself in marriages, whereas Agag was merely terrified at the idea of wooing, not to say winning, any of the princesses that were brought to his notice, and they, on their part, only made the rudest faces at him. Again, George IV., though unkingly in many respects, used to plunge about in the wild pursuit of pleasure, and was supposed to have a kind heart. Agag, on the contrary, never plunged. A cushion and some fish and plenty of repose were the sum of his desires, and as for a kind heart, he never had a heart at all. An unkind heart would have given him some semblance of personality, but there was not the faintest room to suppose that any emotion, other than the desire for food and sleep and warmth, came within measurable distance of him. He died in his sleep, probably of apoplexy, after a large meal, and beautiful in death as in life, was buried and forgotten. I have never known a cat so completely devoid of character, and I sometimes wonder whether he was a real cat at all, and not some sort of inflated dormouse in cat's clothing. There followed a republican regime in this matter of cats. We went back, after Agag, to working cats, who would sit at mouse holes for hours together, pounce and devour, and clean themselves and sleep. But among them all there was no character which ever so faintly resembled even Martha, far less Pusscat. I suppose the royalty of Agag, stupid and dull though he was, had infected me with a certain snobbishness as regards cats, and secretly, given that there were to be no more of those splendid plebeians like Pusscat, I longed for somebody who combined royal descent, for the sake of beauty and pride, with character, good or bad. Nero or Heliogabalus, or Queen Elizabeth, or even the Emperor William II of Germany would have done, but I didn't want George I on the one side, or a mere mild president of a small republic on the other. Just after Agag's death, I had moved up to London, and for a time there was this succession of unnoticeable heads of the state. They were born, those presidents of my republic, from respectable, hard-working families, and never gave themselves out, though they knew quite well that they were the heads of the state, to be anything else but what they were, good, hard-working cats, with, of course, not only a casting, but a determining vote on all questions that concerned them or anybody else. We were democratic in those days, and I am afraid freedom broadened slowly down from president to president. We were loyal, law-abiding citizens under their rule, but when our president was sitting at the top of the area steps, taking the air after his morning's work, it used to be no shock to me to see him tickled on the top of his head by people like tradesmen coming for orders, or a policeman or a nursery maid. The president, in these circumstances, would arch a back, make poker of a tail, and purr. Being at leisure and unoccupied with cares of state, he did not pretend to be anything but bourgeois. The bourgeoisie had access to him. He would play with them, without any sense of inequality, through the area railings. There was a nursery maid, I remember, whom our last president was very much attached to. He used to make the most terrific onslaughts at her shoelaces. But now all that regime is past. We are royalist again to the core, and Cyrus, of undoubtedly royal descent, is on the throne. The revolution was accomplished in the most pacific manner conceivable. A friend, on my birthday 2 years ago, brought a small wicker basket, and the moment it was opened, the country, which for a month or two had been in a state of darkest anarchy, without president or any ruler, was a civilized state again, with an acknowledged king. There was no war, nothing sanguinary occurred. Only by virtue of the glory of our king we became a great power again. Cyrus had arranged that his pedigree should come with him. This was much bigger than Cyrus, and being written on parchment, with a large gold crown painted at the head of it, was far more robust than he whose ancestors it enumerated. For his majesty, as he peered over the side of the royal cradle, did not seem robust at all. He put 2 little weak paws on the edge of his basket, and tried to look like a lion, but he had no spirit to get farther. Then he wrinkled up his august face, and gave a sneeze so prodigious that he tumbled out of the basket altogether, and by accident, or at the most by catarrh, set foot in the dominions where he still reigns. Of course, I was not quite so stupid as not to recognize a royal landing, though made in so unconventional a manner. It was only as if George IV, in one of his numerous landings on some pier, so fitly commemorated by the insertion of a large brass boot print, had fallen flat on his face instead, and was commemorated by a full-length brass, with top hat a little separate. Babies of the human species, it is true, are all like each other, and I would defy any professor of eugenics or of allied and abstruse schools of investigation to say offhand whether a particular baby, divorced from his surroundings, is the Prince of Wales or Master Jones. But quite apart from his pedigree, there was never any question at all about Cyrus. There was no single hair on his lean little body that was not of the true and royal blue, and his ears already were tufted inside with downy growth, and his poor little eyes, sadly screened by the moisture of his catarrh, showed their yellow topaz irises that were never seen on Master Jones. So he tumbled upside down into his new kingdom, and recovering himself, sat up and blinked, and said, I took him up very reverently in both hands, and put him on my knee. He made an awful face, like a Chinese grotesque instead of a Persian king, but anyhow it was an Oriental face. Then he put a large paw in front of his diminutive nose, and went fast asleep. It had been a most fatiguing sneeze. Royal Persian babies, as you perhaps know, must never, after they have said good-bye to their royal mammas, be given milk. When they are thirsty they must have water. When they are hungry they have little finely chopped-up dishes of flesh and fish and fowl. As Cyrus slept, little chopped-up things were hastily prepared for him, and when he woke, his food and drink were waiting his royal pleasure. They seemed to please him a good deal, but at a crucial moment, when his mouth was quite full, he sneezed again. There was an explosion of awful violence, but the royal baby licked up the fragments. We knew at once that we had a tidy king to rule over us. Cyrus was 2 months old when he became king, and the next 4 months were spent in growing and eating and sneezing. His general manner of life was to eat largely and instantly fall asleep, and it was then, I think, that he grew. Eventually a sneeze plucked him from his slumber, and this first alarum was a storm cone, so to speak, that betokened the coming tornado. Once, after I began to count, he sneezed 17 times. Then, when that was over, he sat quiet and recuperated. Then he jumped straight up in the air, purred loudly, and ate again. The meal was succeeded by more slumber, and the cycle of his day was complete. His first refreshment he took about 7 in the morning, as soon as anybody was dressed, and an hour later, heavily slumbering, he was brought up to my room when I was called, buttoned up in my servant's coat, and placed on my bed. He at once guessed that there must be a pleasant warm cave underneath the bedclothes, and with stampings and purrings, penetrated into this abyss, curled himself against my side, and resumed his interrupted slumbers. After a while, I would feel an internal stirring begin in my bed, and usually managed to deposit the king on the floor before his first sneeze. His second breakfast, of course, had come upstairs with my hot water, and after the sneezing was over, he leaped into the air, espied and stalked some new and unfamiliar object, and did his duty with his victuals. He then looked round for a convenient resting place, choosing one, if possible, that resembled an ambush, the definition of which may be held to be a place with a small opening and spaciousness within. That gave us the second clue, tidiness being the first, towards the king's character. He had a tactical mind, and should make a good general. As soon as I observed this, I used to make an ambush for him among the sheets of the morning paper, providing it with a small spy-hole. If I scratched the paper in the vicinity of the spy-hole, a little silver-blue paw made wild dabs at the seat of the disturbance. Having thus frustrated any possible enemy, he went to sleep. But the ambush he liked best was a half-open drawer, such as he found one morning for himself. There among flannel shirts and vests he made himself exceedingly comfortable, pending attacks. But before he went to sleep, he made a point of putting out a small and awe-inspiring head to terrify any marauding bands who might be near. This precaution was usually successful, and he slept for the greater part of the morning. For 6 months he stuffed and sneezed and slept, and then one morning, like Lord Byron in the discovery of his fame, Cyrus woke and discovered the responsibilities of kingship. His sneezing fits suddenly ceased, and the Cyropaideia, or education of Cyrus, began. He conducted his own education, of course, entirely by himself. He knew, by heredity, what a king had to learn, and proceeded to learn it. Hitherto, The pantry and my bedroom were the only territories of his dominion that he had any acquaintance with, and a royal progress was necessary. The dining room did not long detain him, and presented few points of interest. But in a small room adjoining he found on the table a telephone, with a long green cord attached to the receiver. This had to be investigated, since his parents had not told him about telephones, but he soon grasped the principle of it, and attempted to get the earpiece off its hook, no doubt with a view to issuing orders of some kind. It would not yield to gentle methods, and after crouching behind a book and wriggling his body a great deal, he determined to rush the silly thing. A wild leap in the air, and Cyrus and the green cord and the receiver were all mingled up together in hopeless confusion. He did not telephone again for weeks. The drawing-room was less dangerous. There was a bearskin on the floor, and Cyrus sat down in front of the head, prepared to receive homage. This, I suppose, was duly tendered, because he tapped it on the nose, as the king entering the city of London touches the sword presented by the Lord Mayor, and passed on to the piano. He did not care about the keyboard, but liked the pedals, and also caught sight of a reflection of himself in the black shining front of it. This was rather a shock, and entailed a few swift, fandango-like steps with forepaws waving wildly in the air. Horror! The silent image opposite did exactly the same thing. It was nearly as bad as the telephone. But the piano stood at an angle to the wall, offering a suitable ambush, and he scampered behind it. And there he found the great ambush of all, for the back cloth of the piano was torn, and he could get completely inside it. Tactically it was a perfect ambush, for it commanded the only route into the room from the door, but his delight in it was such that whenever he was ambushed there, he could not resist putting his head out and glaring if anybody came near, thus giving the secret completely away. Or was it only indulgence towards our weak intellects that were so incapable of imagining that there was a king inside the piano? The exploration of the kitchen followed. The only point of interest was a fox terrier at whom the king spat. But in the scullery there was a very extraordinary affair, namely, a brass tap, conveniently placed over a sink, half covered with a board. On the nozzle of this tap, an occasional drop of water appeared, which at intervals fell off. Cyrus could not see what happened to it, but when next the drop gathered he put his paw to it and licked it off. After doing this for nearly an hour, he came to the conclusion that it was the same water as he drank after his meals. The supply seemed constant, though exiguous. It might have to be seen to. After that he just looked in at the linen cupboard, and the door blew to while he was inside. He was not discovered till 6 hours later, and was inclined to be stiff about it. Next day the royal progress continued, and Cyrus discovered the garden, 40 feet by 20, but large enough for Mr. Lloyd George to have his eye on it, and demand a valuation of the mineral rights therein. But it was not large enough for Cyrus. I don't know what he expected, for after looking at it closely for a morning, he decided that he could run up the brick walls that bounded it. This was an infringement of his prerogative, for the king is bound to give notice to his ministers when he proposes to quit the country, and Cyrus had said nothing about it. Consequently, I ran out and pulled him quietly but firmly back by the tail, which was the only part of him that I could reach. He signified his disapproval in what is called the usual manner, and tried to bite me. Upon which I revolted, and drove the king indoors and bought some rabbit wire. This I fastened down along the top of the wall, so that it projected horizontally inwards. Then I let the king out again and sat down on the steps to see what would happen. Cyrus pretended that the walls were of no interest to him, and stalked a few dead leaves. But even a king is bounded, not only by rabbit wire, but by the limitations of cat nature, which compel him to attempt again what he has been thwarted over. So, after massacring a few leaves, already dead, he sprang up the wall, and naturally hit his nose against the rabbit wire, and was cast back from the frontier into his own dominions. Once again he tried and failed, appealed to an obdurate prime minister, and then sat down and devoted the whole power of his tactical mind to solving this baffling affair. And 3 days afterwards I saw him again run up the wall, and instead of hitting his nose against the rabbit wire, he clung to it with his claws. It bent with his weight, and he got one claw on the upper side of it, then the other, wriggled round it, and stood triumphant with switching tail on the frontier. So in turn I had to sit and think. But short of building up the whole garden wall to an unscalable height, or erecting a chevaux de frise on the top of it, I had a barren brain. After all, foreign travel is an ineradicable instinct in cat nature, and I infinitely preferred that the king should travel among small back gardens than out of the area gate into the street. Perhaps, if he had full license, especially since I could not prevent him, to explore the hinterlands, he might leave the more dangerous coast alone. And then I thought of a plan, which perhaps might recall my Ries Kaiser when on his travels. This I instantly proceeded to test. Now I had been told by my cabinet that the one noise which would pluck the king out of his deepest slumber, and would bring him bouncing and ecstatic to the place where this sound came from, was the use of the knife sharpener. This, it appeared, was the earliest piece of household ritual performed in the morning, when Cyrus was hungriest, and the sound of the knife sharpener implied to him imminent food. I borrowed the knife sharpener and ran out into the garden. Cyrus was already 4 garden walls away, and paid not the slightest attention to my calling him. So I vigorously began stropping the knife. The effect was instantaneous. He turned and fled along the walls that separated him from that beloved and welcome noise. He jumped down into his own dominion with erect and bushy tail, and I gave him 3 little oily fragments of sardine skin. And, up till now at any rate, that metallic chirruping of the sharpened knife has never failed. Often I have seen him a mere speck on some horizon roof, but there appears to be no incident or interest in the whole range of foreign travel that can compete with this herald of food. On the other hand, too, if Cyrus is not quite well, this very seldom happens, though he does not care for food, he does not either feel up to foreign travel, and therefore the knife sharpener may repose in its drawer. Indeed, there are advantages in having a greedy king that I had never suspected. As the months went on, and Cyrus grew larger and longer-haired, he gradually, as befitted a king who had come to rule over men, renounced all connection with other animals, especially cats. He used to lie perdu in a large flower-pot which he had overturned, ejecting the hydrangea with scuffles of backward-kicking hind legs, and watch for the appearance of his discarded race. If so much as an ear or a tail appeared on the frontier walls, he hurled himself, his face a mask of fury, at the intruder. The same ambush, I am sorry to say, served him as a butt for the destruction of sparrows. He did not kill them, but brought them indoors to the kitchen, and presented them, as a token of his prowess as a hunter, to the cook. Dogs, similarly, were not allowed, when he sat at the area gate. Once I saw, returning home from a few doors off, a brisk Irish terrier gambol down my area steps, Cyrus's area steps, I mean, and quickened my pace, fearing for Cyrus if he happened to be sitting there. He was sitting there, but I need not have been afraid, for before I had reached the house a prolonged and dismal yell rent the air, and an astonished Irish terrier shot up, as from a gun, through the area gate again with a wild and hunted expression. When I got there, I found Cyrus seated on the top step, calm and firm, delicately licking the end of his silvery paw. Once only, as far as I remember, was Cyrus ever routed by anything with 4 legs, but that was not a question of lack of physical courage, but a collapse of nerves in the presence of a sort of hobgoblin, something altogether uncanny and elfin. For a visitor had brought inside her muff an atrocious little griffin, and Cyrus had leaped onto this lady's knee, and rather liked the muff. Then, from inside it, within an inch or 2 of Cyrus's face, there looked out a half-fledged little head of a new and nerve-shattering type. Cyrus stared for one moment at this dreadful apparition, and then bolted inside the piano ambush. The griffin thought this was the first maneuver in a game of play, so jumped down and sniffed round the entrance to the ambush. Panic-stricken scufflings and movements came from within. Then a diabolical thought struck me. Cyrus had never yet been in his ambush when the piano was played, and the griffin being stowed back again in the muff, for fear of accidents, I went very softly to the keys, and played one loud chord. As the Irish terrier came out of the area gate, so came Cyrus out of his violated sanctuary. Cyrus was now just a year old. His kitten coat had been altogether discarded. He already weighed 11 pounds, and he was clad from nose to tail-tip in his complete royal robes. His head was small, and looked even smaller framed in the magnificent ruff that curled outwards from below his chin. In colour he was like a smoky shadow, with 2 great topaz lights gleaming in the van. The tips of his paws were silvery, as if wood-ash smouldered whitely through the smoke. That year we enjoyed a summer of extraordinary heat, and Cyrus made the unique discovery about the refrigerator, a large tin box like a safe that stood in the scullery. The germ of the discovery, I am afraid, was a fluke, for he had snatched a steak of salmon from the tray which the fishmonger had most imprudently left on the area steps, and with an instinct for secrecy which this unusual treasure trove awoke in him, he bore it to the nearest dark place, which happened to be the refrigerator. Here he ate as much as it was wise to gobble at one sitting, and then, I must suppose, instead of going to sleep, he pondered. For days he had suffered from the excessive heat. His flower-pot ambush in the garden was unendurable. So also was his retreat under my bedclothes. But here was a far more agreeable temperature. This is all the reconstruction of motive that I can give, and it is but guesswork. But day after day, while the heat lasted, Cyrus sat opposite the refrigerator, and bolted into it whenever he found opportunity. The heat also increased his somnolence, and one morning, when he came up to breakfast with me, he fell asleep on the sofa before I had time to cut off the little offering of kidney which I had meant to be my homage. When I put it quite close to his nose, he opened his mouth to receive it, but was again drowned in gulfs of sleep before he could masticate it, so it stuck out of the corner of his mouth like a cigarette. But eventually, I knew, he would wake and remember and understand. And now Cyrus is 2 years old, and has reigned a year and 10 months. I think he has completed his own education, and certainly he has cleared his frontiers of cats, and, I am afraid, his dominion of sparrows. One misguided bird this year built in a small bush in his garden. A series of distressing, unfledged objects were presented to the cook. He has appropriated the chair I was accustomed to use in my sitting-room, and he has torn open the new back-cloth that I had caused to be put on my piano. I dare say he was right about that, for there is no use in having an ambush if you cannot get into it. In other ways, too, I do not think he is strictly constitutional. But whenever I return to his kingdom after some absence, as soon as the door is open, Cyrus runs down the steps to meet me, even as Pusscat used to do, and makes a poker of his tail, and says, "Ah!" That makes up for a good deal of what appears to be tyranny. And only this morning he gave me a large spider, precious and wonderful, and still faintly stirring. End of section 13.
Section 14 of the Countess of Lowndes Square and Other Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Roman Noble, romannoble.com. The Countess of Lowndes Square and Other Stories by E.F. Benson. Crank Stories, Chapter 1, The Tragedy of Oliver Bowman. Oliver Bowman was sitting opposite his sister after dinner, watching her cracking walnuts in her strong, firm hands. The wonder of it never failed. She put 2 walnuts in her palms, pressed her hands together as if in silent prayer, and then there was a great crash and pieces of walnut shell flew about the table. It was a waste of energy, no doubt, since close behind her were the nutcrackers that gave the nut eater so great a mechanical advantage. But then his sister had so much energy that it would have been not less ridiculous to accuse the sea of wasting energy because it broke in waves on the shore. Presently she would drink a couple of glasses of port and begin smoking in earnest. "And then," asked Oliver, who was exhibiting a fraternal interest in the way in which Alice had passed her day, "then I had tea at an ABC shop and walked around the park. Lovely day. You ought to have come out." "I had a little headache," said Oliver. He spoke in a soft voice, which occasionally cracked and went into a high key, as when a boy's voice is breaking. That had happened to him some 15 years ago, since he was now 30, but he had made a habit of dropping into falsetto tones as being an engaging remnant of youthfulness. "A good walk in the sun and wind would have made that better," said his sister. "But I don't like the sun," he said petulantly, "and you know I detest the wind." "What did you do then?" she asked. "I read a story by Conrad about a storm at sea. I quite felt as if I was going through it all without any of the inconveniences of it. That is the joy of a well-written book. It enlarges your experiences without paying you out for them." Alice dusted the fragments of walnut shell from her fingers, poured out a glass of port, and lit a cigarette. "I would sooner do any one thing myself than read about any 20, she observed. "I should hate to get my experiences second-hand, already digested for me, just as I should hate to wear second-hand clothes or eat peptonized food. They gotta be mine, and I've got to do them. I mean, digest them, myself. Oliver refused port and took a very little coffee with a good deal of hot milk in it. Considering nature has been making men and women for so many million years, it's odd how often she makes mistakes about them, he said. He constantly puts them into the wrong envelope. She puts a baby girl into a baby boy's envelope and a baby boy into a baby girl's. You ought to have been a boy, Alice, and I ought to have been a girl. Alice could not resist another walnut or two, and the crashings began again. That may be true, she said, but that's not really the point. A woman may be a real woman and yet want to do things herself. The real mistake that nature makes is to give people arms and legs and quantity of good red blood and not give them the desire of using them. Or to give them an imagination without the desire of using it, remarked Oliver. Well, I'm glad I have none, said Alice firmly. I never imagine what a thing is going to be like. I go and do the thing, and then I know. They passed into the drawing room next door, which seemed to bear out Oliver's criticism on nature's mistakes, because the room had been furnished and decorated in accordance with his taste, and with one exception was completely a woman's room. Everything in it was soft and shaded and screened sideways and draped, but in one corner was a turning lathe with an unshaded electric light directly over it. Oliver walked across to an easy chair by the fireplace and took down an embroidered bag that hung on a painted screen there. It contained a quantity of colored wools and an embroidery tambour. He was employed just now on making a chair back in petite point, and could easily fill in areas of uniform color by electric light, though daylight was necessary for matching shades of wool. The design was a perfect, unreal, rustic scene with a cottage and tree and a lamb and a blue sky and a slightly lighter blue lake. It realized completely to him what the country ought to be like, and what the country never was like. Instead of the lamb, there was in real life barking dog and a wasp. Instead of a clean white cottage, a pigsty or a cowshed, where stupid animals breathed heavily through their noses at you. Oliver hated the country in consequence, and never left town unless it was to immure himself from Saturday till Monday in a very comfortable house with central heating, or to spend a few weeks in some other town. But it was delightful to sit in his own pleasant room, and with colored wools make a picture of what the country should be. In the foreground of his piece were clumps of daffodils, which he copied from those that stood on a table near him, for there ought always to be daffodils in the foreground. Alice occupied herself for half an hour or so with an active foot on the treadle of her lathe, and made loud buzzing noises with steel tools and boxwood. Then, as usual, she went to bed very early, after a short struggle to read the evening paper, and left Oliver to himself. These were the hours which he liked best of all the day, for there was no chance of being interrupted and no prospect of having to go out of doors or perform any action in which he would come in contact with real life in any form. Alice's lathe was silent, and all around him were soft, shaded objects and his piece of needlework. But though he disliked the rough touch of life more than anything in the world, there was nothing he liked better than to imagine himself in the hubbub and excitement of adventure without stirring from his chair. Sometimes, as he had done this afternoon, he would read a story of the sea, and thus, without terror of shipwreck or qualm of nausea, listen to the crash of menacing waves and the throb of the racing screw. Sometimes he would spend an hour in the country while his unerring needle made daffodils or lambs, or with the strong effort of the imagination, travel across France to the delightful shores of the Riviera with a vividness derived from the continental Bradshaw. A sniff at the lemon brought in with a tray of wafer biscuits and a siphon could give him the effect of a saunteur through the lemon grove outside Nice, and the jingle of money in his pocket recalled the casino at Monte Carlo, where he saw himself amassing a colossal fortune in a single night, and losing it all again. As a matter of fact, he never set foot in the real Temple of Chance, because there were so many bald females there who looked at his handsome face with such friendly, if not provocative, glances. For though in imagination he was a perfect Don Juan, the merest glance of interest from a female eye would send him scurrying back like a lost lamb to the protective austerity of Alice. Tonight it seemed to him that the habits and instincts of years came about him in crowds, asking him to classify them and construct a definite theory about them for use in practical life. And suddenly, in a flash of illumination, he saw the coherent principle on which he had acted so long without consciously formulating it. He had always hated real people, real experiences, the sun, the wind, the rain, but equally had he loved the counterfeits of them as presented by art in its various forms, and by the suggestions that a lemon or a continental Bradshaw or a piece of wool work could give him. The theory that held all these things together was that life for him consisted of imagination, not of experience, and the practical application of that was to study and soak himself in the suggestions that gave him the sting of experience, without any sordid contact with life. To make a fortune, or lose one, at Monte Carlo would have implied setting cheek to jowl with bold, bad people and risking a great deal of money. It was infinitely better to study the timetable of the trains to Monte Carlo, sniff a lemon, and jingle his money in his pocket. While if he wanted the sense of the hot, smoke-laden, scent-heavy atmosphere, he must smoke a cigarette and sprinkle his handkerchief with mask of fragrant pine. A pack of cards thrown about the table would assist the illusion, and he could say, "Faites vos jeux, messieurs et mesdames," in the chanting monotone of the croupiers. From that night his horizons began to expand, and he wondered at himself for the blindness in which he had hitherto spent his life. The London streets, in spite of the wind and the sun and the rain and the fog, woke into a teeming life of their own, and pelted suggestions at him as the crowd pelted confetti at me carême. He began not to dislike the crowded pavements, for he no longer took any notice of the real people who were there, so absorbing what had become the shop windows, which gave him the material which he translated into dreams. Hitherto, when he had passed a fish shop, he had held his breath, so that the objectionable smell of it might not vex him. And now he inhaled it with a gusto as adding to the vividness of M. Pierre Lat Perche de Hollande. He would stand before a fish shop for 5 minutes at a time, and be no longer in Bond Street, but in the hold of his boat or on the quay at Paimpol. Even the boy in the shop who went out with a flat tray on his shoulder was Mon Frere Ives, and Oliver almost spoke to him in French. Next door was a shop filled with Japanese screens and carved jade and branches of paper cherry blossom. And lo, his fishing experiences were whisked away, and he was living in the land of Madame Chrysanthemum. But it was only for a short while that the shop windows were, so to speak, colored illustrations in books written by other men, for he soon discarded these second-hand canvases and constructed out of them, and the wealth of suggestive material that lay broadcast round him, new and amazing adventures of his own. His senses, and in particular his sense of smell, grew every day more acute, for daily he was keenly on the lookout for a sight or sound, touch or smell, that would be to him a hint out of which he could evolve some fantastic imagination that lived henceforth in his brain as the memory of an actual experience lives in the brain of those who, like his sister, must know that a thing has happened to them before they can call it their own. But of all the senses, that of smell supplied him with the vividest hints. The aromatic odor, for instance, that came out of the door of a chemist's shop would launch him on a brain adventure which lasted the whole length of a stroll down Piccadilly, in which he found himself suffering from some acute and mysterious disease that baffled the skills of doctors, and led them to administer all manner of curious drugs in the hope of bringing him alleviation. Then when he had soaked the honey from his painful experience, for however disagreeable such an illusion would have been in real life, it had in those vivid unrealities the thrill and excitement of such without any of its inconveniences. The sight of a jeweler's window blazing with gems would scatter the clouds of his approaching demise, and muffle the sound of his own passing bell. Section 15 of the Countess of Lowndes Square and Other Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Roman Noble, RomanNoble.com. The Countess of Lowndes Square and Other Stories by E. F. Benson. Crank Stories. Chapter 2. Philip's Safety Razor. Up to the time of Philip's obsession, there cannot have been in all the world a happier couple than he and his wife. As everybody knows, the ecstasy of life has its home in the imagination, and Philip and Phoebe Partington lived almost exclusively in those realms, which were illumined by the light that never was on sea or land. I do not absolutely affirm that sea and land would have been the better for that light. All that I insist on was that the Partington effulgence certainly never was there. It was a remunerative light also, and out of the proceeds they bought a quantity of false Elizabethan furniture and a motor car. A spin in the motor car after the ecstatic labor of the morning cleared Phoebe's head, and they dined together in an Elizabeth room with rushes on the floor. That cleared Phoebe's head too, for nothing in the world could be remoter from the setting of her imaginative life than anything Elizabethan. She and her husband lived in an opulent and lurid present, which, in its turn, was just as remote from contemporary life as most people know it, as were the spacious days that had left their spurious traces on the dining room. They were the most industrious of artists, and often had as many as 3 feuilletons running simultaneously in provincial papers. And the matter of their activity was this. Each morning, directly after breakfast, Philip sat in the dining room and until 1 o'clock proceeded to turn into narrative the very complete and articulated skeleton of the tale which Phoebe manufactured in the drawing room. The imaginative gift was hers. There was not a situation in the world which she could not contemplate unwinking, like an eagle staring into the sun. And these she passed on to her husband, whose powers of putting them into narrative was as unrivaled as his wife's in conceiving them. Picture him, then, with his plump, amiable face bent over Phoebe's imaginings, a perennial pipe in his mouth, and invariably 2 or 3 little tufts of cotton wool stuck on to his cheek or chin where he had cut himself shaving that morning. Occasionally, but very rarely, he had to go into the drawing room to ask the elucidation of some situation. How, for instance, was Algernon Montmorency to leap lightly out of the window, and so regain his motor car, when Phoebe laid the scene in the top room of the moated tower of Eagle's Castle? But Phoebe would always suggest a remedy which cost the minimum readjustment, and 10 minutes afterwards, Algernon would be thundering along the road with the lurid Semitic moneylender in close pursuit. But for such occasional interruption and the periodic lighting of his pipe, he would not pause for a second till the morning's work was over. He never hesitated for a word, for he had at his command the entire vocabulary of English clichés, and he often got through 2 installments before lunch. At 1 precisely, the parlor maid came in, and groping through the fog of tobacco smoke, opened all the windows and began to lay the table, upon which Philip washed off his tufts of cotton wool, snatched Phoebe from her imaginative visions, and strolled in the garden with her till the gong summoned them to the recuperative spell of a mutton chop and a glass of blood-making Australian Burgundy. After lunch they drove in the motor car, returning for tea, and from tea till dinner they read over aloud and discussed their morning's work. In this way, Philip made acquaintance with the subject matter he would be employed on next morning, and Phoebe learned how that which she had written yesterday had turned out. Philip had never had any criticism to make. His wife's imagination seemed to him one of the most glorious instruments ever devised for the delectation of the literary, and she often said that of all contemporary novelists, her husband was the only man capable of handling the situations she poured out in this unending flood. After dinner they played patience, went early to bed, and awoke with an unquenchable zest for the labor and rewards of another day. It is impossible to figure a happier or more harmonious existence. In imagination they roamed over the entire world without the expense or inconvenience of foreign travel. Their spirits ranged through the whole gamut of human emotion, and whatever adversities the Algernon and Eva of the moment went through, their creators and interpreters knew in their heart of hearts that all was going to end well, for otherwise they would speedily have lost their pinnacled eminence as writers of serial stories in the daily press. It is true that Philip's voice often shook as he read, and that Phoebe's eyes were dim as she listened to the written tale of the remarkable disasters and misunderstandings through which the children of her brain had to pass. These are but luxurious and sterile sorrows. In fact, the greatest trial that ever came to them during these halcyon years was when the editor of one of the papers in which the tale was running wrote to say that it was so popular that he insisted on having at least another fortnight of it, instead of bringing it to an end in 2 more installments. That entailed a vast deal of work, for Phoebe had to search the file to find out by what constructive carpentering she could engineer an episode that would be of the requisite length, when the sever were reunited, must naturally be left for the end. But she never failed to manage it somehow, and even when tribulation was great, and for the moment she could not conceive how to spin the story out, her cloud had a silver lining, for all this difficult work was due to the story's amazing popularity. Or sometimes some ill-mannered reader would write to the newspaper office to point out that St. Peter's Church at Rome did not stand on a commanding eminence, or ask more information about the glittering spires on the Acropolis at Athens, or demur to the pellucid waters of the Nile in flood, as it rolled down in blue cataracts studded with milk-white foam. But otherwise their life flows on in an unbroken succession of literary triumphs and domestic happiness. Then suddenly, without any warning whatever, the curtain was rung up on a psychological tragedy. Of Philip, by some species of spiritual infection from his wife, began to develop an imagination. It did not at first threaten to attack what Phoebe in a Gallic moment had once called their vie antérieure, by which she meant their literary labors, but was directly concerned only with the present of a safety razor which she had made him on his birthday, in order to save cotton wool and his life blood. The safety razor consisted of a neat little sort of rake into which razor blades were fitted. Each of these, when blunted by use, was to be thrown away and a fresh one inserted. And that morning, Philip, finding that his blade had begun to lose its edge, tossed it lightly and airily out of the dressing-room window, from which it fell into a herbaceous border which ran along the house. The new blade gave the utmost satisfaction, and precisely at 9:30 he lit his pipe and began his work for the day on Phoebe's scenario. The dining room was just below his dressing room, and at that moment there came a rustle from the herbaceous bed, and Phoebe's adorable Persian cat leaped onto the windowsill from outside, and proceeded to make its toilet in the warm May sunshine. And at that precise and fatal moment, Philip Partington's imagination began to work. It stirred within him like the first faint pang of a toothache. For some quarter of an hour he refused to recognize its existence, and proceeded to clothe in suitable language the flight of Eva up the frozen Thames in an ice ship. Not knowing exactly what an ice ship was, and being aware that his reader would be similarly ignorant, he evolved a beautiful one out of his inner consciousness that skimmed along on a single runner like a skate. It was not, he reflected, any less likely that it should keep its balance than that of a bicycle should. Suddenly he laid down his pen. His imagination was beginning to hurt him. It would be a terrible thing if Phoebe's cat, while it prowled through the herbaceous bed, stepped on the blade of the safety razor. Blunt though it was for shaving purposes, it would easily inflict a cruel wound on Tommy's paw. When his work was done, he must really hunt for the blade and bestow it in some safer place. He took up his pen again and wrote. Ever faster through the deepening winter twilight sped the ice ship, and even controlling the tiller in her long tapered fingers, watched the dusty banks fly past her. "Oh God," she murmured, "grant that I may be in time. The woods of Richmond." The cat had finished its toilet and jumped down again into the herbaceous bed. Philip heard a faint mew, and his awakening imagination told him that Tommy had cut his foot already. With a spasm of remorse, he ran out into the garden and began a frenzied search for the razor blade, which, with such culpable carelessness, he had thrown away. A quarter of an hour's search was rewarded by its discovery, and as there was no blood on the edge of it, he thankfully assumed that he hadn't been punished, nor Tommy either, for his thoughtlessness. He unfortunately stepped on a fine calceolaria and regained the gravel path with the blade in his hand. He locked it up in the drawer of his knee-hole table, where he kept his will and his passbook and his checkbook, and with a free mind returned to Eva, perilously voyaging on the ice past the woods of Richmond, and praying that she would be in time. But suddenly, and for the first time in their dual and prosperous career as feuilleton writers, Philip found himself finding a certain want of actuality in Phoebe's imaginings. They lacked the bite of such realism as he had found illustrated in the poignancy of his own search for the discarded razor blade in the herbaceous border. There was emotion, real human emotion, though only concerned with the paws of a cat and a razor, whereas Eva's taper fingers on the tiller of this remarkable craft seemed to want the solidarity of mortal experience. But it would never do to lose faith in Phoebe's inventions, for it was his faith in them that lent him his unique skill as an interpreter and chronicler of them. And anyhow, the razor blade was safely inaccessible now to any cat on its pleasure excursions, and he turned his mind back to the woods of Richmond. With the unexpectedness of a clock loudly chiming, his imagination began to work. What if he should suddenly die even as he sat there at the table? Phoebe alone knew where he kept his will, and he saw her, blind with tears, unlocking the drawer and groping with trembling hand among its contents. Suddenly she would start back with a cry of pain and withdraw her hand, on which the fast-flowing blood denoted that she had severed an artery or two, and would bleed to death in a few seconds, as had happened to a most obnoxious marquis in the tale, "Kind hearts are more than coronets." Next moment he had unlocked the drawer, and gingerly holding the dread instrument of Phoebe's death between his finger and thumb, looked wildly round for some secure asylum for the hateful thing. Long he stood there in hesitation, then mounting a set of library steps, deposited it on top of the tall bookcase which held the complete file of all the newspapers in which their tales had appeared. Then he set to work again on Eva, who presently ran her ice boat ashore below the Star and Garter Hotel. But half the morning had already gone, and he had scarcely yet made a beginning of the morning's work. Phoebe was unusually buoyant at lunchtime today, but for once her cheerfulness failed in shedding sunshine on Philip. "My dear, I have got over such a difficult point," she said. "Do you remember how Moses Isaacson got Algernon to sign the paper which acknowledged that he was not Lord St. Austell's legitimate son?" "Yes," said Philip feverishly, trying to recall the exact happening of those miserable events. "Well, all that was written in invisible ink, and all he thought he signed was the lease of Eagle's Castle. There, and look, here is the first dish of asparagus." "And how about the lease?" asked Philip. "It was written in watercolor ink, and of course Moses Isaacson washed it off afterwards." "Capital," said Philip. "That does the trick." There was silence for a minute or two as the novelist ate the fresh asparagus, and then Phoebe said, "Tomorrow, dear, you will have to come and work with me in the drawing room. The maids must begin their spring cleaning, and indeed it should have been done a month ago. We will have lunch and dinner in the hall while they do this room, and the day after they will do the drawing room, and I will do my work with you here." Philip's fingers were stealing towards the last stick of asparagus, but at this they were suddenly arrested. "Ah, spring cleaning," he said with assured cheerfulness. "They just dust the books, I suppose, and sweep the floor." She laughed. She had Eva's celebrated laugh, which was like a peal of silver bells. "Indeed, they do much more than that," she said. "Every book is taken out and dusted. They move all the furniture and clean it all, back and front and top and bottom, but you won't know a thing about it, except that our dear Elizabethan dining room will look so spick and span that Elizabeth herself might have dinner in it. Some day we must do a historical novel, you and I. Think what a setting we have here." Though the day was so deliciously warm, it felt rather chilly in the evening, or so Philip thought, and a fire was lit in the drawing room. Phoebe had a slight headache, and thus it was quite natural that she should go to bed early, leaving her husband sitting up. As soon as he had heard the door of her bedroom close, he went softly to the dining room, and again mounting the library steps, took down the razor blade from the cache which this morning had seemed so secure, and went back with it into the drawing room. It would have been terrible if Jane, the housemaid, who always sang at her work, should tomorrow have suddenly interrupted her warblings with a wild scream, as she dusted the top of the bookcase. Perhaps the razor blade would have embedded itself in her hand. Perhaps, even more tragically, her flapping duster would have flicked it into her smiling and songful face, and have buried it deep in her eye or her open mouth. But now this gruesome domestic tragedy had been averted by Philip's indigenous perception of the chilliness of the evening, and with a sigh of relief, he dropped the fatal blade into the core of the fire. He went softly up to bed, feeling very tired after this emotional day. Now that his anxiety was allayed, he would have liked to tell Phoebe how silly he had been, for never before had he had a secret from her. But then one of Phoebe's most sacred idols in life was her husband's stern masculine common sense that, like Algernon's, was never the prey of foolish fears and unfounded tremors. He hated the idea of smashing up his cherished image of Phoebe's, and determined to keep his unaccountable failing to himself. Phoebe should never know. Besides, it would vex her very much to be told that her present to him had occasioned him such uneasiness. He fell asleep at once, and woke to the grey dawn of the morning to the sound, as it were, of clashing cymbals of terror in his brain. The housemaid would clear up the fireplace in the drawing room, and there among the ashes, like a snake in the grass, would be the keen tooth of the razor blade. Perhaps already Philip was too late, and before he could get down a cry of pain would ring through the silent house, betokening that Jane's lifeblood was already spreading over the new Kiddermaster carpet, and he sprang from his bed and with bare feet went hurriedly down to the drawing room. Thank God he was in time, and a minute afterwards he was on his way up to bed again with the razor blade still dusty with ashes, but as sharp as ever, in an envelope taken from Phoebe's table. Temporarily he put it between his mattresses, since it was still only 4:30, climbed back into bed, and vainly attempted to compose himself to sleep. Already he was behindhand with work that should have been done yesterday morning, and when today, with the envelope containing the blade in his breast pocket, he tried to make up for lost time, he only succeeded in losing more of it. There were other distractions as well, for owing to the spring cleaning in progress in the dining room, he sat with Phoebe in the drawing room, and she, quite recovered from her headache, and quite undisturbed by his presence, was reeling off sheet after sheet in her big, firm handwriting of the further trials that awaited Algernon. Sometimes she looked up at him with a bright, glam smile, born of the joy of creation. But for the most part her head was bent over her work, and but a short peal of silver bell laughter from time to time denoted the ecstasy of invention. And falling more and more behind her, Philip lumbered in her wake, with 3/4 of his mind entirely absorbed in the awful problem regarding the contents of the envelope in his breast pocket. Suddenly, brighter than the noonday sun outside, an idea illuminated him, and he got up. "I shall take 10 minutes' stroll, my dear," he said. "Solvitur ambulando, you know, and you have given me a difficult chapter to write." She recalled herself with an effort to the real world. "I think I won't come with you, darling," she said. "I am afraid of breaking the golden thread, as you once called it. Let me see." And she grabbed the golden thread again. At the bottom of the garden ran a swift chalk stream that had often figured in their joint works. And towards this Philip joyfully hurried. He picked up 6 pebbles from the gravel path, put them into the envelope which contained the instrument of death, tucked the flap in, and threw it into the stream. There was a slight splash, and he saw the white envelope shiningly sink through the water until it came to rest at the bottom. He returned to Phoebe with the sense that he had awoke from some strangling nightmare. For a couple of days after that, Philip enjoyed the ecstasy which succeeds the removal of some haunting terror, basking in the sunshine of security. He could look down on the dark clouds through which he had passed, and feel with thankfulness how completely, though narrowly, he had escaped the misty fringe of some trouble of the brain, the claws and teeth and pincers of a fixed idea. The simple expedient of throwing the razor blade into the stream had entirely dispersed those clouds. Until then, he had never known the sweetness of sanity of the sun. Then, with tropical rapidity, the tempest closed in upon him again. He and Phoebe had driven out in their motor car one afternoon, and had dismissed it 2 miles from home in order to have the pleasure of walking back through the flowery lanes. Philip was something of a botanist, and since he was now engaged on the chronicling of the reunion of Eva and Algernon, which unexpectedly took place in a ruined temple near Rome, he wanted to refresh his memory by the sight of the glories of the early English summer, in order to deck the flowery fields in which the ruined temple lay with the utmost possible lavishness of floral tapestry. "The ruin stands for the trial they have passed through, my dear," he explained to Phoebe, "and lo, all around nature breaks into gladness." Phoebe gave a deep sigh. "I think that's lovely," she said. "How I embellish my dry skeleton of a tale, darling, covering it with strong muscles and lovely supple skin. We are happy, aren't we? I wonder if Algernon and Eva were really as happy, even at that moment, as we always are." They had come near the stream that flowed by the bottom of the garden, the bank of which was a tangle of flowers. "Loosestrife, meadowsweet, marsh marigold, willow herb," said Philip. "Delicious names, are they not?" The sound of shrill juvenile voices was heard, and turning a bend in the lane, they came opposite the pool where Philip had thrown the razor blade. There on the bank were 6 small boys in various degrees of nudity and rosy from their bathing. "Little darlings," said Phoebe sympathetically. "What a jolly time they have been having in the water." "Willow herb, marsh marigold," murmured Philip mechanically, looking around for the traces of blood on the stream bank. He took a firm hold of himself and managed to walk across the wooden bridge that led to the bottom of the garden with some show of steadiness. But he almost reeled and fell when, looking into the pool, he saw the razor blade, its encompassing envelope having been destroyed by the water, shining on the pebbly bottom of the stream like tragic Rhine gold. When they had had tea, he made some lame excuse of studying flowers a little longer and slipped down again into the stream. The boys had gone, and taking off his shoes and socks and rolling his trousers up to the knee, he waded out over the sharp pebbles to where his doom flickered in the sunshine. With the aid of his stick, he propelled it into shallower waters and picked it up. Then, shivering from the brisk water and tearing his socks as he pulled them over his wet feet, he returned with it to the house in a state of more miserable dejection than Algernon had ever been, even when he sat down on the ruins of the Roman temple, unaware that Eva was just about to come around the corner with April in her eyes. For the next week, Philip carried the razor blade about with him in a stud box that during the day never left his pocket, and at night reposed under his pillow. He made several attempts to get rid of it in a way that commended itself to his conscience, which seethed with scruples and imaginary terrors, burying it once in the garden, and at another time throwing it into the ash bin. But the sight of his terrier digging into the potato patch for a suitable hiding place for his bone caused him to disinter it from the first of these, and the second entailed a dismal midnight visit to the dustbin, when, one evening, Phoebe casually alluded to the dustman's approaching visit. On another occasion, he was fired with the notion of embedding it in the interstices of the rough bark of the ilex at the end of the garden, well out of reach of curious fingers, and with the stud box in his pocket, climbed with infinite difficulty up into its lower branches. But while wedging it into a suitable crevice, the bough on which his weight rested suddenly gave way, and he fell heavily to the ground, while the blade flashed through the air like Excalibur and plunged into a bramble bush. It was, of course, necessary to get it out, and this prickly business, combined with a sprained ankle, brought him almost aground in the shoals of despair. He began contemplating enlisting as a private in the British Army, though well over the military age and of obese figure. Perhaps he would find some opportunity in Flanders of throwing it, suitably weighted into a German trench. Only the thought of Phoebe left alone and making up interminable plots, with no one to turn them into narrative for her, kept him from this desperate step. Meantime, his work halted and languished, for sleepless nights and nightmare days miserably affected his power of composition, his style, and even such matters as punctuation and spelling. Pete grew anxious about him and recommended a holiday, but he had the wisdom to know that the only thing that kept him on the safe side of the frontier between sanity and madness was determined application to work, however poor the output was. He felt that he might just as well pack his boxes and go straight to Bedlam instead of making a circuitous journey there via the Malvern Hills. It was when his condition was at its worst that there gleamed a light through the tunnel of his despair. The editor of the Yorkshire Telegraph, who wanted another story by the Partingtons, with the shortest possible delay, wrote to him suggesting in the most delicate manner that life in New York would present an admirable setting for the tale, especially since the United States had come into the war, and offering to pay his passage to the salubrious city if he would favorably consider this proposal. And all at once Philip remembered having read in some book of physical geography, studied by him in happier boyish days, that the Atlantic in certain places was not less than 7 miles deep. He read this amiable epistle to his wife. "Upon my word, it sounds a very good plan," he said brightly. "What do you say, Phoebe? I will give me the holiday of which you think I stand in need." Phoebe shook her head. "Do you propose that I should come with you?" she asked. "Why should a holiday among the submarines do you more good than the Malvern Hills?" The thought of the deep holes in the Atlantic grew ever more rosy to Philip's mind. Even the hideous notion of being torpedoed failed to take the color out of it. "My dear, these are days in which a man must not mind taking risks," he said. She smiled at him. "I know your fearless nature, darling," she said, "but what is the point of running unnecessary risks?" Local color. There is a great deal in Mr. Irthington's remarks. I don't agree. I should think with our experience we ought to be able to describe New York without going there. We didn't find it necessary to go to Athens or Khartoum or Mexico. "True," he said, "but perhaps my descriptions might have gained in veracity if we had." That was a tiresome letter to the Yorkshire Telegraph about the spires on the Acropolis. If we had been there, we should have known that there weren't any. He fingered the stud box in his pocket for a moment, and his fingers itched to drop it over a ship's side. "My part of our joint work might gain in true artistic feeling," he said, "if I described what I had actually seen. Art holds the mirror up to nature, you know." "Yes, darling, but do you think Shakespeare meant that art must hold the mirror up to New York?" asked she. "I fancy there is very little nature in New York." He took a turn or two up and down the room, while the box positively burned his fingertips. "I can't help feeling as I do about it,"